Support for Boston Public Radio comes from Emerson College, shaping society through creative expression and daring ideas, where independent minds move the world forward. Emerson College. Become a creative force. Learn more at emerson.edu. DCU is proud to sponsor this conversation from Boston Public Radio. More at dcu.org.
Ahead on Boston Public Radio, the Republican Party is fracturing over, get this, the infrastructure bill. NBC's Chuck Todd will join us to discuss a Republican lawmaker who received death threats for supporting a bill about roads and bridges, and what consequences, if any, a GOP rep will face for sharing an anime video showing him killing fellow lawmaker Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Then we'll ask you, is bipartisanship officially dead and gone, and do you care?
I'm Jared Bowen in for Marjorie Egan. Kyle Rittenhouse took the stand in his own defense yesterday, maintaining he felt he was under attack when he allegedly killed two men during a chaotic night of protests in Kenosha last year. Andrea Cabral will join us to discuss the 18-year-old's trial. That's ahead on Boston Public Radio.
Welcome to Boston Public Radio. I'm Jim Browdy. Yes, Marjorie is off visiting a little tiny baby. She'll be back very soon. Sitting in for is Jared Bowen, Executive Arts Editor at GBH. Hello there, Jared.
Hello again, Jim.
And joining us on the line to talk all things politics is Chuck Todd. Chuck is the moderator of Meet the Press, which you can catch Sunday mornings, at 10:30 on NBC Boston. Channel 10 on most providers. Also the host of Meet the Press Daily on MSNBC and the political director for NBC News. Good morning, Chuck Todd.
Well, good morning. Is this a grandchild?
It is a grandchild, and to say that she is over the moon is really
my God.
Beautiful little girl.
You know, It's so funny. I've you whatever it is as a parent, you cross that threshold, and I'm now like, I'm looking forward. I think I'm under 10 years away, and I'm like, I'm looking forward to this.
Well, let me tell you, Marjorie's only been talking about it for 10 years, so.
Yeah.
She is really happy. I'll send your best.
Yeah, I'm not ready yet. My daughter's 17. I'd like to get her through college and all that stuff. So minimum 10 years.
Okay.
But where I have to say, after being with a niece of mine and they're great, I get it. It looks exciting.
Yeah, it sure as hell does.
What you do is you hang the baby's back. That's the part I'm looking forward to.
Hey, Chuck, I often end our discussions with a question about your childhood, still your favorite team, the Green Bay Packers, because as a Miami kid, there was no Miami team.
Yeah.
So let's start rather than end. What's your take on the behavior of Aaron Rodgers and the near unanimous condemnation by other high-profile people in sports about his lying about his vaccination?
Well, I think it is the lying. And look, I am such a defender of football because I think it's the ultimate team sport, and I think it really teaches you how to work with others. I think it's just a great way, no matter when you do football, middle school, high school. There is something about it, and because guess what? If one person fails their assignment, the whole thing can come undone, and that's what makes this to me very. I understand quarterbacks are more important than every other position, but this isn't basketball, right? With that extra diva layer. At the end of the day, you got to be a member of a team. Imagine a general on the battlefield deciding not, lying, basically telling everybody they had to go through the vaccine mandate, which the military does, but the general decides, I'm going to go with an alternative method. All of a sudden, you'd lose there'd be a lot of people in the rank and file going, I don't know if he's that much of a leader. And that's the way I look at it. I just think Aaron Rodgers has essentially no longer has abdicated his leadership position, right? And you expect your quarterback to be that. So I think I worry it's going to be devastating to the team unless, we'll see. Well, none of us know what his relationships are in the locker room, but that's the type of thing that can undo a locker room. The rules for thee, but not for me.
One last thing about it, I'm sure you've seen on social media, it's all over the place, that the line that Aaron Rodgers gets a, whatever it is, $7,000 fine for lying and putting all his teammates in jeopardy, as you said. Colin Kaepernick takes a knee and he's banned from the sport for life. I don't think that's a ridiculous comparison.
By the way,
you?
and look, you want to? I'll take the politics out of it. Let's move Colin Kaepernick. How about suspending Tom Brady for 4 games for deflating football?
That's a very good point. Yeah.
And I'm not sitting here to butter up. I mean, I think that Brady should have been more forthcoming. But my goodness, the NFL got a cell phone. The NFL suspended him 4 games. And again, they were worried about the integrity of the game. That was the reason. Okay, fair enough. This is the integrity of people's health. You put other people's health in jeopardy here. So, yeah, I think a fine doesn't feel like the right call. For the team, the fine made sense. I say this as a Packer fan. I wouldn't want to see it. I'm surprised they didn't lose draft picks. Correct me if I'm wrong. The Patriots lost draft picks.
I believe so.
Yeah, I'm surprised that didn't happen. And again, maybe the Aaron Rodgers thing will, I'm surprised the NFL didn't say, look, here's the fines for now. We're going to continue our investigation, and we're going to deal with this after the season. And at least give the impression that there might be more punishment to come. But look, Roger Goodell, my God, where is the guy? As always, there's a crisis in the NFL, but the ratings are up, money is in, so he sticks his head in the sand. He does nothing about the Gruden situation, nothing about the Washington football team, nothing about Aaron Rodgers. So, how do you expect the sport to police itself when its leader does nothing? Sits there and literally sticks his head in the sand. Because, again, the money's rolling in and the ratings are up.
Well, he's earning his $60 million a year. We're talking to Chuck Todd from Meet the Press.
Well, Chuck, moving to Washington, we're looking at what's happened with the 13 House Republican members who broke with the rest of their party and dared to vote for the infrastructure bill. This is the bill that's going to bring money home to fix our neighborhoods in a climate where you can just about believe, I assume that would happen. I can believe that happened. I mean, this really does seem unbelievable that these House members are getting death threats for voting for the infrastructure bill.
Well, it just shows you, not only that, for voting for a bill that would have been almost identical to the bill that Trump was trying to put together. Okay, this bill is not like, it's almost the identical bill he would have signed. Look, Trump has created an atmosphere that says, the Democrats are un-American, and if you work for them, you're working against America. So there is a portion, we're getting to this point. This is, this is over. If you told me this was over immigration, you probably wouldn't be surprised if there was some heated complaints, because immigration is a very polarizing issue. I'm not condoning that. I wouldn't condone anything that was happening, but at least you would sit there and say, well, we know immigration is polarizing. But that this is over roads and bridges, really? This is the beginning of the end of the democracy. It just shows you how much demonizing and dehumanizing, in this case, what Trump has done to the Democratic Party in Jersey. It's like, it's equating the Democrats to the communist Chinese, right? Which is, we know where the right-wing rhetoric is going. They're trying to make it where it's un-American to work with the other political party, when to me it's un-American not to work with the other political party.
So not only do we have people threatening the lives, we're going to play a little bit later after we bid you adieu, the incredible
Everybody
phone
needs
call.
to hear this.
The Upton.
People need to hear this stuff.
The Upton.
All of it. People need to hear this stuff, because I do think sometimes we out of sight, out of mind, and you need to see and feel this cancer.
And everybody knows, of course, about this Congressman Gosar who does this anime thing where he essentially kills Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. I hadn't thought about it till you're just answering Jared's question, but what kind of person who's not a lifer says, this is the job I want to hold, that if I vote my conscience and it maybe doesn't fit in the appropriate hole, not only is my life going to be threatened, my kid's life is going to be threatened, my spouse's life is going to be threatened, my young staff life's going to be threatened. I mean, I assume you really have to be almost odd to decide this is the way I want to spend my life, no?
Well, I'm going to take it right up into New England, right? And the Chris Sununu decision.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
It's so funny. Apparently Washington Republicans were shocked and surprised. I look at it as, I'd have been shocked and surprised. Everything I understood about the guy is that he had sort of some common sense and he was kind of normal. So it would have shocked me if he did want to do this. Boy, the point is, it goes to your point. Like, who the hell in their right mind would say, oh, this is what I want to do after I've given to public service? Like his decision seems perfectly logical to me. He was basically like, well, okay, so what if I win? I'm going to go down there and do what? Be an obstructionist? You know, that's not what he thought he was getting into. And I think, you know, there's a great line that a former aide to John Boehner, Michael Steele, is said earlier this week. He says, you know, currently public service appears pretty unappealing. Well, the more unappealing public service is, the more unappealing your public servants are going to be.
Oh, that's a good one. You know, by the way, for the few people who are not following New Hampshire politics, Chris Sununu, the Republicans were hoping was going to challenge Maggie Hassan, and he announces Chuck suggesting he was going to run for a fourth term as governor of New Hampshire, essentially saying, I don't want to go down there and do nothing. I want to stay here and do something. We're talking to Chuck Todd.
Well, perfect segue into our, wondering what the larger bill, the other bill that's looming, the social services bill, what that means especially among moderate Democrats and any Republicans who may have been eyeing that. Is there spillover here from what they just saw happen with this last vote?
No, I think the issue that may be impacting the negotiations there is obviously these inflation numbers that are spooking some. Certainly Manchin has said this, he is concerned about this. Now, the Build Back Better bill itself isn't really something that's going to impact inflation. So if you care about inflation, what's your answer? You want to raise taxes? That's one way to solve an inflation issue. Or do you want to get the Fed to raise interest rates? Both are very unappealing options. But I do think this could give Manchin even more leverage to pare it back a little bit more, to perhaps keep the programs in there from expiring too quickly and things like that. But I do think that's what's having an impact. And I think that's going to slow down this negotiations. I know the House thinks they're passing something next week. Maybe they do, but this thing is, I think we are months away from resolution, not weeks.
Yeah, but you're talking about the House, while Manchin is, of course, the obsessive focus for understandable reasons of all of us. Wasn't it is it Abigail Spanberger from Virginia, I think, Congresswoman, Democrat? Isn't she the one that said the other day that Joe Biden was not elected to be FDR? That, to me, was a scary thought for the Biden agenda, no?
No, it is. And I think it's what she's thinking about, the constituents that make or break her district, right? Which is these folks in the middle who don't want who voted for Biden to calm things down, not to shake things up, right? Obviously, there's a progressive and more liberal wing of the party that's going, we got to do something with power. We have power. Let's do something. We've been making these promises. We got to do something. But there's about a third of the coalition that is like, we've done a lot. Let's let this settle in. And by the way, the country didn't elect us to do all of this social stuff. At least that third of the electorate believes. They elected us to keep the crazies away, right? And so I think that's certainly what Spanberger is addressing there. But I think, again, I understand, and I talked to the White House about this, and they do flinch at that FDR comment. It's sort of like, look, this has been the problem. Democrats have been too timid. They haven't tackled these big problems, and these big problems only get worse. So there's good arguments on both sides of this debate. It really all matters on are you worried about the next 2 years of your political power, or are you worried about the country's direction in the next 10 years? And both are reasonable things to be focusing on.
Going back to the Trump effect and the Trump alliances as they're supposed to be constructed, what are we to read from what Chris Christie said recently?
I love this.
That this is a moment to look forward, and got himself into this divide with Donald Trump. Obviously, the two seem to have broken. I mean, is this about Chris Christie's political future, or is he pressing back on the Trump hold on the party?
I think this is about Chris Christie desperately looking for relevancy again, right? This is a guy who was Donald Trump's coat holder, right? Who legitimized Trump first, right? Remember, he got out and endorsed him, and he became the first semi-establishment figure to give Trump cover. and he basically said he made it safe for everybody else to go in. So he has a huge, I think he's trying to declare some independence from Trump because he owns a lot of this. He will never, Chris Christie never accepts any responsibility on things, ask the people that he has to go to prison on his behalf. But
that's right, Bridgegate, of course, yeah.
Yeah, let's not forget what kind of leader he was. The rules are for thee, not for me. But this is, to me, about him trying to separate himself from Trump. He's got a lot more Trump baggage than most. Now, maybe it makes him a credible Trump challenger, right? I mean, in fairness, he could, I know what Christie's arguing. Hey, I'm a bully, I'm a jerk, and I could do what Trump does, but I'm also responsible when it comes to governing, which I think both things can be true. And I think he's thinking, hey, I can give you the bluster of Trump without the drama of Trump. I don't know if the Trump base would respond to that, and I do think that as long as Trump is there, anybody that takes him on, he wants to, look at already how he's going after him, he doesn't, so again, I do think this is good for Chris Christie's ability to perhaps get a paid speaking gig or get on a corporate board. But that's what this feels like.
I'm a little lower rent than you, obviously, because I'm loving this thing. And I have to say, the beauty of Christie, and my opinion of him is almost exactly like yours, is he can give as well as he gets at time. The comeback, after he does the original thing that Jared mentioned, and Trump trashes him, of course. What was his line? To Axios or something in the last 24 hours? He says, well, last time I ran for re-election, I got 60% of the vote. He lost to Joe Biden. You got to love that, Chuck Todd, no?
I do, but the problem he's got is while Trump was incorrect that he left with a 9% approval rating, the correction is 19%.
Okay.
Like that's not okay. You're like, oh, sorry for that typo. That's not exactly hey, it's not 9%. It's 19%, which is among the worst approval ratings anybody could have as they leave office.
So I have one last Trump thing. We only have a minute left. If the archives ultimately have to disgorge all the Trump stuff to the January 6th committee, and it's as damning as most of us assume it has, does that change anything in terms of the electorate of this country, or just another day in the life of Donald Trump?
Are the hearings going to be televised for 3 or 4 straight days? Are the country? I think a lot of it has to do with how the country learns this information. Is it really well-written stories in the New York Times and the Washington Post and MSNBC coverage, or is it wall-to-wall congressional hearings, a la Iran-Contra, Watergate, et cetera? I do think if you want it to have an impact, it needs to be public televised hearings and seeing these people tell their story in front of a camera. That's the only way it's going to have the impact that you're talking about. Well,
here's one vote for televised hearings. Chuck Todd, it's good to speak to you as always. I think you can congratulate Marjorie directly next Thursday.
That'd be great.
Great. Good to talk to you.
All right. All right, Jared. All right, Jim.
See ya.
Thank you so much. Chuck Todd joins us every week. He's the moderator of Meet the Press, which you can catch Sunday mornings at 10:30 on NBC Boston. That's Channel 10 on most providers. He's also the host of Meet the Press Daily on MSNBC and the political director for NBC News. Coming up, we're opening up the lines to ask you about your thoughts on the bygone ways of bipartisanship. That's ahead on Boston Public Radio, 89.7 GBH.
Welcome back to Boston Public Radio. I'm Jim Browdy. Jared Bowen is sitting in for Marjorie. On Monday, I think it was this week, Republican Congressman Fred Upton, he's from Michigan, shared this disturbing voicemail with CNN's Anderson Cooper of somebody threatening him and his family over support for President Biden's infrastructure deal. And we're going to play the sound for you. Before we do, I want to repeat what Jared said to Chuck Todd a few minutes ago. This is for voting for a bill to fix and build roads and bridges and expand broadband. Here's part of that voicemail.
Traitor. That's what you are. You're a piece of traitor. I hope you die. I hope everybody in your family dies. You piece of trash mother. Voted for dumb. You're stupider than he is. He can't even complete a sentence. You dumb mother. Traitor. Piece of mother. Piece of trash. Hope you die. I hope your family dies. I hope everybody in your staff dies.
Again, because he voted for an infrastructure bill. Upton was one of 13 House Republicans to get behind the bill, which is set to be signed by President Biden, I think, next Monday. But it's not a stretch to say that a similar bill would have gotten the full backing from the GOP were it to have been brought to the floor under President Trump. So we're opening the lines asking you, what do you make of yet another refusal to reach across the aisle on an issue and when you do, look what happens, on an issue as non-controversial as repairing the nation's roads and bridges and that sort of thing. And to you, is it yet another sign of the death, and I mean dead and gone, the death of bipartisanship? And if it is, does that matter to you? Do you care, or is your attitude is even if there's no more bipartisanship, that's them over there, that really doesn't affect my life? Give us a call, 877-301-8970, 877-301-8970. When I said a minute ago, Jared, that, does it matter? I don't mean, I didn't cast it right. I didn't mean, does it matter? Are you worried about certain legislation that won't get through because the Democrats' majority is so slim and they may lose their majorities in 2022? I am of the belief, and feel free to correct me or disagree if you do, that how Congress and the president behave in their work, especially when it's as high profile as everything is these days with cable news, trickles down to the rest of us. I mean, we had a caller, I think it was the other day, you weren't here yet, we were talking about the hockey thing in Danvers and what happened to the kids in the locker room, and then, the anti-Semitic comments at other schools and the racism. And one caller said, this is what happens in the era of Trump. People treat each other like this, the end of civility, the end of that. I think this kind of grotesque partisanship where when you're nonpartisan, when you're bipartisan, your life is threatened, your family's life is threatened, does trickle down to the rest of society, and it coarsens, which may be a euphemism, how we relate to each other. Is that am I exaggerating the impact of this?
No, I don't think so at all, because this was orchestrated too. This was very deliberate.
Yeah.
This is Marjorie Taylor Greene blasting out the numbers, the office numbers of these House Republicans who voted for the infrastructure bill. Again, the bill that was to make our neighborhoods better. I mean, this is what this is about, to make sure that we're not covering another bridge collapse.
And that will benefit every single Republican and every constituent who's making calls like that, every single one of them.
Exactly. So this was orchestrated. She blasts out the numbers. Then they get these thousands of calls, just like the very disturbing one and profane one. I'm thinking, I can't believe we're playing something like this laden with F-bombs on the radio. But as Chuck Todd says, it's important for people to hear and understand. And of course it filters down. And of course it goes into this discourse. And then you do wonder what gets us out of this.
Number's 877-301-8970. I really, I don't, how there's certain things. I'm sure some of you are listening and saying, Jim, you just woke up to this? You just realized this? No, I didn't just realize this. But I think it's because of what all three of us, including Chuck Todd, have said. This is an infrastructure bill. This is not, as Chuck said, and he wasn't saying it was okay. If it was an immigration bill, you might understand this. Yeah. He wasn't saying it's okay, obviously. This is an and by the way, I think we said to him, I can't remember, 19 senators, including Trump's sycophants like Lindsey Graham, voted for this bill. 69 people, 19 Republicans voted for it, 69-30. Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader in the Senate, voted for this thing. And if this generates this kind of reaction, and by the way, Upton wasn't the only one who got threatened from what I've read. He was not an outlier. This is not aberrational. Even if it was aberrational, it's horrible. This is the nature of our relationship with our coworkers. And add to that fact that this Gosar, a lunatic congressman, does that anime thing where he's killing Ocasio-Cortez. And as a ton of analysts have said, let's have it within GVH. I mean this sincerely. If I posted on my Twitter account an anime thing where I have a sword and I'm killing you, how long do you think I'd still be working here? I would assume
you would be out of here immediately. Yeah.
In a second. Yeah. I mean, is there any other where you work out there? I don't care what side of the political aisle you're on. If you did that, do you think your boss would let you last for another nanosecond there? And not only is it accepted here, the Republican leader, McCarthy, he's crickets, has said not a single word. That kind of behavior is acceptable behavior. And if it's acceptable among the leaders, in quotes, in Washington, then it's acceptable in our lives as well, at our hockey games, at our community meetings, in our relationship with our coworkers. This is really a scary time.
It's also not an aberration. What happened with the 19 senators who voted for it earlier this summer? Steve Bannon, through his social media channels, had their numbers published so that they could get the same exact phone calls.
About that.
So this is just going to keep continuing.
877-301-8970. By the way, if anybody thinks Jared and I are going over the deep end on this thing and want to calm us down, we'd love to talk to you because I want to be calmed down. But this is really, listen to this. Just if you listen again, Google it and listen again to the message that Fred Upton's office got. You know what Upton also said, by the way, is he said, while they threaten my family and me and whatever, and as horrible as that is, he said, I have a lot of young staff people who didn't come to work thinking this was part of the job. And think about your coworkers. I mean,
well, that's a really good point. You were asking Chuck Todd that, and I was thinking the same thing. Why would you run for office? And I think, why would you stay in office? Look at all of those images after January 6th. We had all those young staffers who don't get paid very much. They go into government thinking they're going to do something, affect change, and you see them cowering under their desks. And then to know that their boss is getting a phone call where somebody wants them dead in addition to everybody else. Yeah, why do you go into government at this point? If you're taking your family's lives into risk, you have to really weigh that.
Then one more obvious point on my endless list of obvious points, and then we'll get to your calls. Liz Cheney has the audacity to separate from her party on a pretty important issue, what the future of the president of the United States, Donald Trump, should be. She gets drummed out of the party. Gosar threatens the law. I mean, it produces an image of killing a coworker. And yet again, this world is so upside down. Scott on the road. You are first on Boston Public Radio. Welcome, Scott.
Good morning, gentlemen. I'm trying to make sure my blood doesn't boil.
Good. I'm glad. You're in the same place. Go ahead.
Here's the issue I have. I mean, we have a teenager that went into a crowd with a semi-automatic weapon. That's on trial. We have a jogger that went outside, went jogging and got killed. That's on trial.
Ahmaud Arbery, yeah.
And it's amazing. And here we go. The latest that I've just heard recently, and I listened to a podcast called Beau of the Fifth Column, and he mentioned that in Virginia, the school committee is talking about doing book burnings. So until the middle of the Republican Party, or whatever is left of the middle of the Republican Party, stops acquiescing to what's going on with the most radical piece of it. And I mean, I think it happens on both sides, but obviously this is getting a little bit too far out of hand. Until that starts to happen, we're just on a collision course where democracy is not going to work anymore, and it's happening at a lightning pace at this point. I'm not sure at what point who has to die before we get to a point where we start calling out the most extreme points of our own party and our democracy. Yeah, I don't hear anybody on the Republican side, for the most part, calling out any of these people. So,
well, there are very few. And by the way, the only place I disagree with you and said when you hear it on both sides, I'm not saying the Democrats are sin-free, but you have not seen this kind of behavior on the Democratic side of the aisle. There's a lot to criticize them for, but tolerating this kind of behavior is not among those things. Scott, thank you very much for your call. My blood's boiling too. I mean, I feel almost exactly like almost everything is permissible. It's almost like any kind of bad behavior, any kind of maltreatment of your fellow human beings, including violent maltreatment of your fellow human beings, is totally acceptable. I think he is sadly and totally right.
All right, let's next go to Annabella in Worcester. Hi, Annabella.
Hello, Annabella.
Hi. How are y'all doing?
We're good. I mean, considering we're fine. Yeah.
Considering the conversation.
Exactly.
Yeah, I'm calling. I'm calling because I think that we have held on to bipartisanship as the symbol of our democracy for a long time, and we know it has not been working, unfortunately. And so I think it's time, especially for Democrats, it's not getting us anywhere. And I think it's time that we start thinking of strategies beyond bipartisanship. Because it's been dead, at least for me. I'm fairly young, and my entire sort of understanding of politics has been incredibly polarized. And I think it's just a symbol we hold on to to believe that our democracy is working when we know it's not.
You know, Annabella, you're fairly young. I'm fairly old. So we have both ends of this discussion here. And maybe I miscast what I'm saying. I agree with you in terms of the strategic reality. Marjorie and I have said a lot here. Democrats should learn to play by the same rules that Mitch McConnell plays for, by the way, like with the filibuster. I didn't mean so much, formal bipartisanship in terms of voting. I meant that the reaction when you're not when you engage in bipartisanship, like these 13 House members did on the Republican side, 19 Republicans on the Senate side, that the response is threats of violence, threats to cast you, lose your party position. It's almost like the spillover from partisanship. And so even if you accept that the Democrats, as you say, Annabella, have to go their own way, and I unfortunately agree with you right now, the rest of it is really toxic, don't you think? That hurts everybody, not just them?
Yeah, I think we slipped into tribalism. It's our response to you're working with the other side, and it's like we corner further into our ways of thinking and our belief systems. It's really unfortunate.
It is really unfortunate. Annabella, thank you for calling. We appreciate it.
Well, she raised a point about something I wonder about a lot, especially having young kids in my family, which is they're going to grow up in this environment. Is this all they know? And I think this is what Annabella was saying, too. So if this is really all you know, what is the structure of government and discourse going forward? These are your expectations. There was kind of a course correction with the most recent elections. So because I had also worried what young kids' perception of the presidency would be, given the behavior of the previous occupant of the Oval Office. We see more presidential behavior now, but if this is going to be, or if we're in this for long haul, what is the next generation of leaders?
Well, my kids weren't young during Trump, but the thing that we talked about all the time is like after the infamous the Hollywood, Access Hollywood thing came up.
Right.
When your 12-year-old kid says, can I do that? I mean, the president, well, he wasn't president then, but a would-be president can do that sort of thing. The racism, if it's okay at the top, why is it not okay? And even if your kid is not asking the question overtly, obviously, by osmosis, it gets into the kid's hip.
My nephew asked that of my
really?
My
is
sister.
That really so?
He had to ask her what the, grab them by the, he had to ask what the P word was.
Really?
That's how she had to have that conversation.
And what'd she say exactly?
Well, I
come back in a few years.
Basically, because he was too young to be having that conversation.
It's I think Marjorie has told the story about one of her kids was really young during the Monica Lewinsky thing, and her kid asked what in any case.
Okay.
Yep. Ellen in a car. You're next on Boston Public Radio. Hi, Ellen. What's up?
Hi. I've been saying this for years, that it's just the Republican Party is just eating itself. So you ask why McCarthy's not saying anything. I think he's terrified. I mean, I certainly wouldn't put out a Biden sign, and I don't really like to talk politics because I'm afraid of who I'm talking to. You know what I mean? And these people were, astonished that Biden won, and I was like, it's just because people aren't saying anything. A lot of people don't agree with you. Most of the country doesn't agree with you, but we're also terrified because you have a gun on your head. We're really afraid of you. And politicians, if they say one thing out of turn, that's what happens. They get those kind of messaging.
Well, Ellen, before you continue, I think it's totally believable that an average rank-and-file elected official would be scared to death. I mean, secretaries of state, appointed secretaries of state are getting death threats all over the country, as we well know. But you'd think when you're I don't think Kevin McCarthy is worried about that. Maybe he is. I think he's worried that Donald Trump will frown on something he says, and if the Republicans win back the House, as they appear to be in the direction of doing, that Donald Trump will tell the Republicans not to vote for him as Speaker of the House. So, whether your it's a fear of a weapon or fear of I was going to say a tweet from Donald Trump, but he can't tweet, a negative comment from Donald Trump, it's pathetic. It's how do you live with yourself, Ellen, when this is the way you live your life?
Well, I just kind of try not to say anything, and I just feel like it's getting so much worse. And
I agree.
One of the big things, what if they actually caught Ocasio-Cortez? What if they actually got their hands on her? Yeah. What would have happened on January 6th?
Well, Ellen, do you not believe that if the insurrectionists, or the tourists, as some people call them in the Republican Party, had gotten to Mike Pence, that he might be dead? I mean, I believe it. I mean, if you're chanting hang Mike Pence with a noose outside, I would say that Mike Pence might have had a short shelf life had they gotten to him. So I'm with you also, Ellen. Thank you for the call. 877-301-8970.
Yeah, I worry about it. So many historians have told us, don't worry, we've been here before, we always come out of it. I always go back to, and I've talked about this on the show before, having, for some reason, this book in particular stuck with me, Robert Caro's Passes to Power, about transitioning from JFK to Johnson. And during JFK's presidency, we were at the same stalemate. There was acrimony. They couldn't get anything passed. They couldn't get anything done. I don't know that we as Americans understood the level of rancor because we didn't have social media or the cable channels to remind us of it every single night. But the only thing that changed was his getting killed. That's what it took for the country to say, wait a minute, we need to come together. It took the country to see something so awful and experience collectively something so hideous. So this is what I worry about now. I mean, what do we have to anticipate in order to have the country coming back together? Hopefully it's something not so brutal, but I'm struck by what one of our earlier callers says. Who has to die for this to happen? I mean, it feels like that's what we're careening toward.
Well, and who has to die? And, read all these books and read all these stories about the plotting in the White House after Trump lost the election. I mean, there was like literally a thread between what they did and an attempt to literally stage a coup. I mean, and that's not, I'm not choosing those words without care. There was discussion about a coup that was supported by a lot of his staff people, and he may run again. David in Oregon, you're next on Boston Public Radio. What's up, David?
Hi, David.
Oh, yes. Hi, Jim and Jared.
Hey.
Third time, short time. I've only been listening to you for a while, but I try to call from Oregon. Anyway,
thank you.
I love your show.
Thanks.
And what I wanted to say is I grew up with this, with alt-right influence in my family, and then I broke out of it because, I have a very sensible mother and a lot of intelligence and comparative knowledge. However, I just wanted to say, of course, it's very important that you're saying these things, or that's my opinion. And if the Democratic Party doesn't come together and stop going off on so many extremes and diversions, then there's enough blind faith misinformation that Trump and the sycophants will. Before Trump, it's like most of the GOP presidential candidates were keeping the evangelical extremists kind of an arm's distance away. But somebody like Trump, they just want to win at all costs, and it doesn't matter what it costs. It doesn't matter if somebody, someone who listens to them would think, well, because I believe in that, then obviously they could participate in the recording you just played, which is just absurd and atrocious, and nobody in their right mind would ever do something like that. And so, bring the extremes together and then create the numbers, and then, like we're trying to do, keep the the voting rights with as much equality, which I interpret as going high, and keep the voting rights equal, and then try to stop them from all their gerrymandering with, just trying to win at all costs, because otherwise it will just keep going in the direction you're talking about. There would be no gerrymandering. Eventually they'll have the voting rights. You get these absurd, crazy people like the Taylor Greene and the Bannon guy, where it's like, oh, well, if you don't do what we say, here's the phone number, and feel free to call them and harass them and, threaten their lives or their families' lives. And that's something that law enforcement should be involved in. Of course, we're concerned about the First Amendment, but at a certain point, like, for example, I hold Donald Trump responsible for the people who died at the January 6th.
But, David,
if he hadn't said that, those people. Yes, sir.
I just want to interrupt you to say I agree with what you're saying, and that rests in the hands, as we've discussed with a few people the last couple of days, of Merrick Garland. I mean, I am convinced, and I like to think I've read the laws and people's analyses objectively, that he committed crimes on that day for which the Department of Justice should prosecute him. And if they don't, I think there's a message there, too, that if you have that kind of position, there is nothing that you can't get away with. David, thanks for your third call. Call us again soon. 877-301-8970. And it is amazing. I mean, it's somebody's going to die. David made the point they already have died. In David's estimation, those people who died on January 6th were in part because of Trump's instigation of the whole thing. I think that's a pretty powerful and convincing case.
Well, we are talking about the sad state of bipartisanship in America and what it's going to take for America's political parties to come together. The conversation continues on 89.7 GBH Boston Public Radio.
Welcome back to Boston Public Radio. Jim Browdy, Jared Bowen sitting in for Marjorie. Off our conversation with Chuck Todd and the threats that the 13 House members and 19 Senate members, all Republicans, have gotten, at least some of them, from including death threats, with the wake of having the audacity to cross over the aisle, so to speak, and vote with Democrats in support of this infrastructure bill that is now sitting on the president's desk. We're talking about the death of bipartisanship in the most violent sort of ways, and not so much vis-a-vis Washington, even though some of you are. My major concern, and I think Jared's too, is what it trickles down to mean in our everyday lives. And I think we've seen the Trump effect in our everyday lives in multitudes of ways. And I think having this on your screen and listening to the voicemail left for Fred Upton just gives people idea. You weren't with us when we went down for the Trump inauguration. A whole bunch of us were eating at Comet Ping Pong Pizza in Washington. That's the place where this guy heard some of the crazies, including, I think, General Flynn's son. I'm not 100% sure about that, talking about how that Hillary Clinton and John, I think it's John Podesta, one of the Podesta brothers, was running a pedophile ring in the basement of Comet Ping Pong Pizza, which I don't think has a basement. I'm not sure. We went there. We talked to the general manager, who talked about when the guy came in, I think from one of the Carolinas, he had an armed weapon. He shot. The restaurant was full, the GM told us. And luckily, he shot and didn't hit anybody. But there was another thing where a guy's intention was to go kill people because he'd been falsely told by some of these provocateurs that there was a pedophile ring, which was run by the presidential nominee Hillary Clinton. I mean, it is so wildly out of control and so weaved into our everyday lives. It is just horrifying.
Well, that's the thing. These narratives, these conspiracy theories, which we once used to laugh off, thinking it was people tending to their tinfoil collection at home in their basement. But it's not that at all. There's a huge population that is essentially being broadcast to have this, as you say, woven in or ingrained in their lives that these things are actually happening, and they can't see the forest for the trees to understand the lunacy of so many of these claims.
How many of these people, Republicans, say that Joe Biden wasn't elected president of the United States?
A lot.
I mean, a majority.
This is why
40% of Republicans think violence is appropriate to take back democracy. 40 damn %. I mean,
and this is what we all need to understand. We have to come to grips with the fact that this is a lot of people's reality. It's not the reality, but it's a lot of people's reality, and that's what we have to to contend with the facade. All right, let's go back to our callers and start with Noah in Bolton. Hi, Noah.
Welcome, Noah.
Hey, Jim and Jared.
Hey.
This is my first time calling in.
Oh, thank you.
I just want to say I think bipartisanship, it's dead, and I think it's been dead for perhaps longer than we really think it has been. A lot of the Republicans, even though in the Obama era, their strategy was a lot of just whatever Obama is pushing, just go against that. Mm-hmm. I think that's where a lot of the anti-immigration stuff has come from, because it was just a push against Obama, and that's been one of the things that stuck around. Meanwhile, in the Trump era, they went with him. They just went with him. Once he was legitimized, they just went with him, and he has helped. Donald Trump has helped to legitimize then like a next generation of Republicans, the true believers like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who just that they'll is if Trump endorses them, then whatever crazy stuff will go down with them.
Well, no, the only I totally agree with your first thought is that bipartisanship has been dead for a long time. Specifically, when you're talking about Obama, we've discussed on the show, I can't remember who wrote it, his or her book, that on the night of the inauguration, Mitch McConnell and a bunch of people met at a bar in Washington and were talking about how they would stop everything Obama would do. The difference, I think, that came in the time of Trump, the lack of bipartisanship, which was not quite as extreme as now, but let's assume for argument's sake it was, didn't come with threats of murder if you chose to be bipartisan. That's the qualitative difference that started in the era of Trump that is continuing now through this vote. And even when it happened, it didn't happen on things, at least in my recollection, as mundane as whether or not you voted to make bridges and roads safer. Let's keep in mind, this is what he got the death threat about because Representative Upton voted with the Democrats, he and 12 other House Republicans. So, yeah, it's been dead for a long time, but the response to having the audacity to vote with the other side has never been this violent and never, ever been this extreme, at least in my estimation. Noah, thanks for your first call. I hope you make another one soon. 877-301-8970. I wonder, when I heard this tape for the first time, I was watching Anderson Cooper on Monday night when I heard it. If I had the courage to do, and it shouldn't have taken much courage to do what these Republicans did and vote for the right thing, and I got death threats, would I decide I'm not going to do this again? Like you said before, it's one thing to get a threat yourself. In my nonprofit life, I used to get threats all the time. I laughed them off when I was doing tax stuff, whatever. But when they start threatening your kids and your family, and in the old days, you might have said, well, that's just idle stuff. And then there was January 6th, and then there was Comet Ping Pong Pizza, and then there was Jews shall not replace us. And, it's a different kind of time. And do you say I'm going to endure this because I care so deeply about serving my country and my constituents? It's tough,
It's a thing I've been weighing. I mean, I imagine some people say, no, I'm in this to serve my country and I'm going to do that and I'm not going to be intimidated. But I wonder what it does to families, what it does to their partners, and how do you go home and have that conversation that I want to do this, but
your life may be at risk.
We have to install security, and maybe we have to have somebody in front of the house. And I can't believe that we're talking about this kind of thing. Let's go to Anna, I believe, calling from Middleborough. Hi, Anna.
Hi, Anna.
Hi.
Hi.
Anna Suk Forth. I'm a history teacher, and I've been one for 37 years. And next year I graduate, and I'm looking at what do I do in the future. Now, as a history teacher, I conduct my classes in such a way that I quote Eleanor Roosevelt. I say, great minds discuss ideas, average minds discuss events, small minds, and you could add hands, discuss people. And so I want to elevate
could
the
add
conversation.
Hands. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I want my kids to elevate the conversation. I said, we're better than the adults that we see out there in politics. And I would love to run for office, but I'm not the right kind of crazy. And I put right in quotations. I would never be elected. And I think when you have the Marjorie Taylor Greenes of the world being elected and probably reelected, I think it reveals an awful lot about who we are as Americans. That is a lot. That is allowed. And I really want to make a difference, but I don't know how we change this.
But Anna,
I've never felt that kind of hopeless.
Yeah, that's not good. And maybe a perfect segue into what I was going to ask you. You can answer what we were wondering earlier in this conversation about how this filters down into the next generation. You've seen that. What do you experience in your classroom?
Well, I have firm control over my kids, but I'm a benevolent dictator, I say. But I'm jokingly.
I bet you are.
I do have hope. In the next generation, but I don't want to be in the classroom. I worry about the next generation of teachers, the types of school committees that are being elected. I couldn't even be elected on the school committee in my town.
Yeah, but Anna, even if you were elected to the school committee of your town, you know what risk you're taking if you have the temerity to say the kids should wear a mask so they stay safe? You can get your life threatened, too. I forgot about that, the school committee. Hey, Anna, I wish you were my history teacher, and we wish you luck in your future endeavors. Thank you much for the call. We appreciate it. We didn't mention that a ton of the people who voted to impeach Trump the first time, the second time, whatever, of the few Republicans who had the courage to do it, are resigning, are not running for re-election because they think they can't be. The guy from Illinois, Kinzinger, is that his name? I think was essentially gerrymandered by the Democrats. Interestingly, out in a very poor spot. That guy Gonzalez. I mean, it's just you can't win because obviously you cross Trump in the most serious of ways, and Trump still has colossal power, which really, it's a way to end this. The fact that Donald Trump, as an ex-president who lost Congress, who lost the election, has never gotten a majority of votes, by the way, he did get a majority of electoral votes, obviously, the first time, which is what matters, has such unbelievable control, not only over average people in the Republican Party, self-identified Republicans, but people who are elected. Is just it's a commentary upon how far we have fallen, and with a much less amplified voice. Not all of his speeches are televised anymore. He doesn't have the social media outlets, and he's still. This is what baffles me is how that hold continues when the message is I was going to say not muddled because it's getting out there, but it's somewhat constrained. Well, and also on that Twitter front, it's a very excellent point you make. Virtually every legal expert on the air, off the air, with whom I've spoken, whether they're pro or anti-Trump, who's civil libertarian type, agrees that if he announces for the presidency again, Twitter can't keep him off the social media thing. So we're not going to depress you all day today like we do every day, just for a few minutes, and maybe a few minutes with Andrea Cabral, and then we'll try to lift your spirits a little bit too. All right, well, coming up, speaking of Andrea, lawyers for 18-year-old Kyle Rittenhouse are calling for mistrial just as they attempt to paint his alleged shooting of 3 protesters last year as an act of self-defense. Andrea Cabral will join us for that conversation and more on this week's edition of Law & Order. She's next on 89.7 GBH, Boston Public Radio. Ahead on Boston Public Radio, Andrea Cabral's here a day after a rare moment, a murder trial where the defendant, Kyle Rittenhouse in this case, takes the witness stand in his own defense. Then today, of course, marks the first Veterans Day in 20 years. The U.S. has not been involved in a major conflict, but the wounds from Afghanistan run deep. We'll be joined by Eric Edstrom. He's a former captain in the Army who's written about his experiences in Afghanistan and the torturous process of getting his interpreter out of the country. I'm Jared Bowen in for Marjorie Egan. Then we'll be joined by Cassie Puma, the chef and owner of Sarma in Somerville. She'll discuss how she melds Middle Eastern spices with expertise and being named Boston Magazine's Best Restaurant of the Year in the middle of the pandemic. That's coming up on Boston Public Radio. Welcome back to, what is this, hour number 2 of Boston Public Radio. Marjorie Egan has the day off, that's why I had to say that. And I am Jim Browdy, and Jared Bowen is sitting in for Marjorie Egan. Get that right there. So things are getting really tense in the trial of 18-year-old Kyle Rittenhouse. He's the guy who traveled from his home in Illinois to Kenosha, Wisconsin last year, bringing an AR-15-like weapon with him, shooting 3 people, killing 2 in the street during protests over the police shooting of Jacob Blake. Rittenhouse took to the stand yesterday, sobbing and talking about how his deadly use of force was merely self-defense. Here with us to talk about the case in general and the very unusual situation where a defendant in a murder case takes the stand himself and the larger implications of this trial is Andrea Cabral. Andrea's back for another edition of Law & Order. She's the former Suffolk County Sheriff, former State Secretary of Public Safety, and now the CEO of Ascend. Hey there, Andrea. Good to talk to you.
Hello, Jim. Hello, Jared.
Hi there.
Hi, Andrea. So, yeah, just to go right to the heart of, as Jim just mentioned, it is very, very rare that we see somebody who's on trial for murder testify in their own defense. Why are we seeing it here, and is it going to work, especially after his sobbing testimony yesterday?
Well, you can mount a self-defense defense and not have the defendant take the stand. Goodness knows that's done, all the time. It is a much greater hill to climb on a self-defense claim in a murder case like this, where there is video of at least some of it, and you have the facts that this case has without putting the defendant on the stand. I'm sure part of what factored into the defense's strategy here was that he's young and he has a baby face and that he would be sympathetic. So that's one of the other things that, defense counsel will take into consideration is how their client will come across. And, he didn't disappoint, bursting into tears, which, while the jury probably doesn't know this, he certainly wasn't crying when he went to Kenosha, when he was walking the streets with that weapon, when, after he was finally arrested. He wasn't crying when he walked past the police saying that he had shot someone that night, and wasn't crying when he posed in bars, even though he was underage, with these sort of Proud Boy types who made him their hero and raised money for his defense. So, the tears on the stand, you would have to take into context. I just don't know how much of that the jury will know. But in this case, it would be almost impossible to mount a successful self-defense defense without him testifying. So I think that's really what it's about, is that no one's going to be able to, they couldn't get this information in before the jury any other way.
Well, I want to disagree with you, I think, a bit. But first, about the crying, there was a lot of talk on social media as to whether or not it was staged. I don't know, but I do know this was a very well-prepared witness, and this is, in my opinion, just a good example of how well he was prepared by his lawyers. Here's a back and forth between Rittenhouse and one of the prosecutors during yesterday's testimony.
Everybody that you shot at that night, you intended to kill, correct?
I didn't intend to kill them. I intended to stop the people who were attacking me.
By killing them?
I did what I had to do to stop the person who was attacking me.
By killing them?
2 of them passed away, but I stopped the threat from attacking me.
Stop the people who were attacking me. Andrea, when the first, I don't know his name, and I'm sorry, the guy he shot in the bicep and didn't kill, who was an early witness, when he said that he was pointing his gun at Rittenhouse, my sense was that was the end of the trial, that you didn't need to have Kyle Rittenhouse. And by the way, I've never prosecuted a criminal case, and you've prosecuted many, so you have much more. Obviously, I have no experience. You have a huge amount. Regardless of what happened in the testimony about the 2 men whom he killed, and he made a case yesterday, they were going after him too, that this first witness who was injured severely, acknowledging that he pointed a gun at him, you don't think there's at minimum one juror who's going to say that's the classic definition of self-defense, and at worst, Rittenhouse, at least in my estimation, ends up with a hung jury, no?
Well, you're talking about, I think his name is Gage Gross.
That is him, yes.
If I'm pronouncing that right.
I don't know how to pronounce it either. That is the guy I was talking about, yeah.
Yes. But I think that I may have this wrong. I thought he acknowledged that he was carrying a Glock pistol, but and I didn't see his testimony, but I certainly heard him in an interview today where he said he didn't raise the pistol to Rittenhouse, and Rittenhouse is actually holding an AK-47, an assault or some sort of assault
like
rifle,
an AR-15,
standing in front of him holding it. Yeah. So this is not, the context of this that I think is so critical is that this young man never had to cross state lines with a weapon that he was not legally allowed to possess. No one goes anywhere with an assault rifle without having some sense that they're going to use it. And he would say that he had to use it, and I really do think that the devil is going to be in some of those details. But at least one of the people he shot in the back. Mm-hmm. And you cannot use deadly force in defense of property. His testimony was he came to Kenosha to defend property in another state, which he does not own and does not have the authority to defend or prevent from vandalism or theft. So you have someone who lacks the maturity, the right, or the authority to do any of the things that he did, crossing state lines, carrying an assault weapon he was legally not allowed to possess. That's where you start. I would argue as the prosecutor, I would argue to the jury, that's where you start with Kyle Rittenhouse. And when you look at everything else that unfolded, it has to be in the context of his affirmative decision to cross state lines with an assault weapon and go into what was chaotic, and to not leave and to not back down once he got there and he saw what was going on. But he stayed there, and 2 people ended up dead and another person ended up seriously injured. Kyle Rittenhouse doesn't have a scratch on him.
Andrew, before we leave this, let me quickly ask you, too, the defense lawyers for Kyle Rittenhouse are now also asking for mistrial. That is not unusual, especially in trials such as this. Does this have any weight? And they're saying it's because, well, there is a dispute over the basis of Rittenhouse's testimony yesterday and how much of that was based on evidence he heard during the trial. So there became this spat between the DA questioning and what the defense attorneys have interpreted here.
Yes. So this is the judge that told the prosecution that they could not refer to the 2 deceased people as victims, which I will tell you is very unusual in my experience as a lawyer. Usually prosecutors are not prohibited from referring to actual victims as victims, regardless of the defense that the defendant is mounting. And, I probably would have some less concern about the exchange between the judge and the prosecutor. He felt the prosecutor was crossing the line or coming close to crossing the line by in some way alluding to Kyle Rittenhouse's decision to remain silent or stand on his, right to remain silent at the time of the crime, and now sort of having all of these explanations to explain the evidence that he now knows has unfolded. Judges can get very upset about that. If prosecutors, prosecution should not have done that, should not have even come close to that. I absolutely agree with that. And judges don't want mistrials. Once a jury's in panel, they want to get through it. So I understand. I think the judge's reaction was a little strong, but I understand that. When I put it in the context of him not wanting the prosecution to even refer to these victims as victims, it does make me a little bit concerned. But I will say that any judge would not want a prosecutor to do anything that imperils the conclusion of that trial or causes there to be even a motion for a mistrial. Defense makes motions for mistrial all the time, but, it can be a solid ground for that if a prosecutor crosses the line.
I want to get back to the victim thing in just 1 second, but I do want to read from the testimony of this Grosskreutz, or whatever his name is, the guy who was shot in the bicep. Here is a question from the defense lawyer, from Rittenhouse as one of his lawyers. It wasn't until you pointed your gun at him, advanced on him with your gun, now your hands down, pointed at him, that he fired, right? And the guy says yes. So, for the record, he acknowledged that he was pointing the gun at Rittenhouse. And that's what worries me in terms of even if that the self-defense claim there, I would argue, is so strong, or at least so potentially strong, that I worry that it's going to spill over into the other the 2 killings that he committed. And again, I think a hung jury is the best the prosecution can hope for. If you want to comment on that, it's fine. If not, I want to get back to the victim thing for a second. I
think that the question from the defense attorney was he didn't shoot you until you pointed the gun at him.
Right.
And the prosecution's retort was, help me understand why Gage Crosskreutz with a pistol in his hand is a threat to kill you, but you with an AR-15 pointed at him is not a threat to kill him. Yeah. That's the devil in the details thing that I'm talking about. And I don't think your concern is illegitimate at all. You never know what a jury is going to do. But I think if I saw someone, with an AR-15 pointed at me and I had a gun on me, I would probably make that known to that other person, or I would be ready to use it. But the jury will ultimately decide, which came first.
By the way, I want to clarify, when I say I have concern, I want justice to be served here. If the jury believes he's not guilty, he's not guilty. If the jury believes he's guilty, guilty. When I say concern, I worry about the bigger picture thing here, that if this guy is acquitted, even if it's on the merits, that the message it's sent for vigilante justice around this country, and as you said, crossing state lines with an AR-15-like weapon because you've decided that it's your obligation to protect property in a place where you have no property, it becomes more of a Wild West country than it already is. We're talking to Andrea Cabral. Andrea, I was going to say I want to change the tone of the conversation to something lighter, but it's not really lighter, but I'm going to change the tone anyway. There was a story that Jared and I both read about how these former mobsters, who are killers in almost all these cases, are now doing podcasts. That's not so surprising. They've served their time. They either negotiated immunity deals with the government, whatever. But the point of the article is that they're so fascinating that it makes law enforcement people, like you used to be, curious enough to listen, or even more so, since they have immunity, they occasionally admit to crimes or provide information about other people's crimes that those law enforcement people can use. This one is unbelievable. Sammy the Bull Gravano, his name is Salvatore Gravano, has a podcast called Our Thing. He was part of the Gambino family. He was the underboss in the 80s, killed a ton of people. That's not in dispute. Did some time. This clip's a little long, but by the way, you have to listen to it carefully, everybody, until the very end. Again, Sammy the Bull Gravano's podcast called Our Thing.
Grandmother was in her 80s, 85, 86 years old. She was suffering, a lot of pain. She was wheelchair bound. We would have to take her upstairs. She lived on the second floor, and then take her out of the wheelchair and carry her down the stairs and stuff. I really wanted to get her out of this pain. I picked her up from the bed, put her in a wheelchair. I brought her to the head of the stairs, and I threw her down the stairs. There was no pain. On the fourth bounce, she was out of pain. So I really felt I did a good thing for myself, for her, and the family.
Now I have to go home. I cannot even continue now.
Yeah, no. I think I'm supposed to ask a question, but I can't come up with one. What's your reaction to that, Andrea Cabral?
Well, I don't care what he's got immunity from. It wouldn't be that.
Are you right? Yeah.
I don't. This whole thing. It's really kind of funny to me that you said this. Moving to the lighter side. In this whole story, the whole New Yorker story, I just find horrifying and disgusting. That the normalization of serial murderers to the point where they are monetizing their crimes, because the reason they have these podcasts is to get subscribers, and that's how they make money. And Sammy Gravano calls it, he's now, making an honest living doing podcasts. But for the fact that what he has to talk about is serial killing at his hand, apparently not just of people who were in his circle for whom the possibility of death was a daily thing, and that was understood, but apparently killing 80-something-year-old grandmoms because he's decided that they need to be put out of their misery. People are paying to listen to this. He is making money from this, and I don't understand, like Jared, how he doesn't get arrested. I mean, you can't just prosecute somebody just because they've admitted to a murder. You need more evidence than that. But I can't believe that he's being allowed to do this, and there's no pushback. It's just astonishing to me.
So, okay, I'm going to stay. I'm not going to go home. I'm going to stay because...
Why don't you two make a citizen's arrest on this guy? I mean, really.
Andrea, I'm
serious.
I will be at your house in 20. I will pick you up We will head down there. I mean,
I brought her to the head of the stairs, and I threw her down the stairs.
And then he left.
There was no pain. On the fourth bounce, she was out of pain. Then he laughed, so I really felt I did a good thing for myself, for her, and the family. For her and the family.
Complete psychopath. Complete psychopath.
All right, but we have to think that they're not thinking. But he's not the only one who's doing a podcast like this, and so people understand this isn't just a niche audience. Hundreds of thousands of people are listening to these podcasts, and as you say, they're making them wealthy men for it. So they can't be thinking this completely through to think that they are not tipping their hat as the FBI is combing over all of this. I mean, they ostensibly they're using this and will be able to use this to go after some of these guys or other guys, right? So much for Omerta.
So much for Omerta.
Yeah, well, I appreciate the fact that the FBI is listening and that they are gleaning what they believe is valuable information from listening to these podcasts. But it is routine in murder trials when someone is convicted for a judge to order, even if it's a civil trial for wrongful death, it happened in the O.J. Simpson case, that you cannot profit from this crime. So if you write a book, you can write a book if you want to. You sign off on your life rights if you want to, but that money will not go to you. There ought to be a way to prevent something like that in this arena. I don't care whether or not he's, been given immunity for certain kinds of crimes connected to his time in the mob. The idea that you would then profit from it and it be so lucrative that it frees you to commit, to admit more crimes is just, it's kind of the sad state of affairs that that's where we are.
You don't think the immunity grant from the government could have included, I don't know, including killing any grandparent that you might... we almost never play sound 2 times in a row, but this is so rich. I hope everyone will bear with us. We're going to treat you again to Our Thing, Sammy the Bull, Salvatore Gravano. Again, killed a ton of people before he went to jail as part of the Gambino
19 people.
Family, 19 that we know about. By the way, there's a Bulger family alum who killed somewhere near 19 people, who's now, isn't he collecting Social Security on the North Shore? He did a fairly short term. I'll check that out in a minute. Here's that clip about his the grandmother he loves.
Grandmother was in her 80s, 85, 86 years old. She was suffering a lot of pain. She was wheelchair bound. We would have to take her upstairs. She lived on the 2nd floor, and then take her out of the wheelchair and carry her down the stairs and stuff. I really wanted to get her out of this pain. I picked her up from the bed, put her in a wheelchair. I brought her to the head of the stairs, and I threw her down the stairs. There was no pain. On the 4th bounce, she was out of pain. So I really felt I did a good thing for myself, for her, and the family.
On the 4th bounce, I missed that the first time. It is really... Hello?
Yeah, he just likes killing. He's just a serial killer.
Yeah, he's a serial killer. We're talking to Andrea Cabral. Now, I think, why don't we spend the last 2 minutes with Andrea? We really can lighten it up about something we're going to discuss with our listeners a little bit later in the show. Do you want to do that, Sharon?
Yeah, Andrea, Portugal's really cracking down. How do you even segue?
Well, this fits. She's an employer. A lot of people work for her to send.
But so you are an employer, and Portugal. So how would you feel about living in Portugal, where they tell you that with all of the work from home that we're all doing, a lot of people are doing now, and extended hours, that you can no longer, there are laws prohibiting when you can text and when you can't text. Basically, you can't text your employees after hours. How do you feel about that?
I think it's great. I mean, this didn't originate with me. I think I saw it on Twitter like a lot of people did.
Yeah.
But we keep calling it working from home when it is essentially living at work. Because now, you can be reached at any time. And I know I do it. I respond to emails at 2 and 3 in the morning, 1 o'clock in the morning, and I send them. And so I kind of like this idea that there's a cutoff period where your employer just can't reach you because you're not getting paid to work 24 hours a day. Why should they be able to contact you 24 hours a day? Unless it's, accepting an emergency, perhaps.
By the way, if anybody wants to look this, it's the right to disconnect is the term of art that I guess people use. But the right to disconnect, I guess, is on the employee's behalf, that they can turn off all their devices. And then the flip side is, I guess, what exists in Portugal, that was being referenced by Jared a minute ago, is where the employer has an obligation not to even reach out to those employees. Could you live with that in your business?
I would welcome it, quite frankly. And there's a part about this law, the other part that's really kind of great, is that if under the new rules, an employer could be forced to pay for the increased expenses as a result of working from home, such as gas and electricity bills. I kind of like that, too.
On that note, Andrew Cabral, it's been a pleasure as always. Thanks so much for your time.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Andrea. Andrea Cabral is a former Suffolk County Sheriff and Secretary of Public Safety. She's now the CEO of Ascend. Well, coming up, a conversation with Afghanistan war veteran Eric Edstrom about the fraught efforts to get his friend and former interpreter out of the country during the Taliban takeover, and the disconnect so many Americans have about the realities of a war half a world away. Keep your dial tuned to Boston Public Radio 89.7 GBH.
Welcome back to Boston Public Radio. I'm Jim Browdy. Jared Bone is sitting in for Marjorie. Our next guest, Eric Edstrom, first met his friend, known for our purposes as Rock, when he was deployed overseas in Afghanistan more than a decade ago. In a must-read piece published this month in Politico, Edstrom describes patrolling shoulder to shoulder with Rock, who served as his infantry's translator. In the years since then, Eric Edstrom worked to help Rock make it out of Afghanistan, a task that became all the more difficult this summer as the U.S. made its chaotic exit from America's longest war. Eric Edstrom is a Stoughton native. He graduated from West Point, deployed to combat in Afghanistan as an infantry officer, former Army captain. He's also a senior fellow at the Eisenhower Media Network. His latest book is Un-American, A Soldier's Reckoning of Our Longest War. Eric Edstrom, we really appreciate your time. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for inviting me, Jim.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here. So we were very much captivated by your writing. You have just these unbelievable observations and, of course, insight into what's happening right now. But for context, if you could just start by giving us a sense of your background, when and how you were deployed for your service in Afghanistan.
Yeah, sure thing. I grew up in Massachusetts, as you mentioned, in Stoughton, and graduated in 2003. So it was sort of the height of the zeitgeist of post 9/11 war mania. And during that period of time, sort of when thinking about the future and a desire to serve a greater purpose, found my gravity with West Point. So I attended West Point and graduated in 2007. And from there, went through the sort of standard pipeline of infantry courses, including Ranger School and Airborne School and Reconnaissance School and others, and was deployed in really the heat of things in 2009. So I deployed in May 2009 for a little over a year and returned in June 2010. During that period of time, as a infantry platoon leader, I was in charge of about 28 soldiers, of light infantry soldiers from across the country. Sometimes I refer to them as sort of a wobbly assemblage of misfits and Marlboro men. All types, all sizes, all political affiliations, all hometowns, the rest. And we were in Kandahar, which at the time was one of the most bombed out areas in terms of IEDs in the country. And month after month, we were setting the bloodiest month in the Afghan war records for coalition forces. Within about 4 months into my year-long deployment, 25% of my platoon had become injured and casualties, and many more after that deployment became casualties in another way. The long tail costs of war don't happen all at once. In fact, there's some that have more pervasive, longer-term effects. Being enrolled in alcohol or drug rehab, one has committed suicide, one is in prison for life for murder. And the long tail costs of war are very long and complex. And during that time is when I met Rock, as you mentioned.
Yeah, we want to talk about a couple of those people in a minute, Eric Edstrom. But first, how long were you serving before you came to the realization that this whole endeavor was a mistake, that it was unwinnable?
Well, I mean, at West Point, you are training very intensely to focus on the things that are within your control. Mm-hmm. Your job is to become the best sort of company level officer that you can be. And you push some of the larger and broader and more complex upstream thoughts like, is this a war worth fighting? And, are we actually benefiting the people of the United States or the people of Afghanistan from doing these things? So instead, you work on your soldier tasks and drills and become proficient at shooting, moving, and communicating, the sort of tenets of what it is to be an infantry soldier. And, you hear murmurs, of course. Your older classmates who graduated a year or two before you at West Point talk about their times in Iraq or Afghanistan in unfavorable terms, many expletives being used, or favorably the goat rope of this sort of chaos and disorder, and it having sort of nothing to do with the protection of American citizens at home. But really, it only took days of being on the ground to realize that this was unwinnable and a circular movement.
So what does that do then when you're on the ground and you're realizing this almost immediately, but you know that you're there for the long term?
Well, I mean, it was one of the hardest times in my life. Absolutely. I wrestled with that quite frequently. And in my book, I sort of refer to taking these emotions and putting them into sort of self-made barrels and casting them like nuclear waste into sort of a pit below, because you can't really deal with them at the time. The show must go on. I had friends that were injured and killed during the course of that deployment. There isn't time for grieving. There isn't much time for anything other than just to continue doing the patrolling. And during that period of time, I realized that all of the sort of rah-rah thank you for your service that comes from American culture, which is very different than other countries in the way that they think about their veterans and their military force, is not actually to the benefit of American soldiers. I talk about in the article in Politico that you referenced about a thank, don't think mentality. And that is sort of attributable to this, where we're very quick as a culture to thank soldiers and pat them on the shoulder at the airport and say thank you for your service, while sending them to their fourth year-long deployment to a self-defeating, negative-sum war that's not yielding any results. And to me, that isn't patriotism. That's betrayal.
That thank, don't think line in your piece, Eric Edstrom, really has stayed with me. Can't shake it. And I think you're so right. It's not just the public who has virtually no skin in the game, is completely not engaged. Obviously, there's no draft. One of the reasons why people like Charlie Rangel, a former congressman from Harlem, used to file a bill every single year was to reinstate the military draft, was not because he wanted it to happen, but because he thought it would all of a sudden convince people, a la Vietnam draft days, to care about something. But as you note, Congress doesn't give any more a damn about this or engage in terms of never declaring war, yet fighting them, fighting incredible number of conflicts under these nearly ancient authorizations to use military force. So it's not just the public that lets people like you and people who served under you do what they do and suffer like they suffer. It's our elected representatives too, no?
Entirely. You're spot on. And the message that I would love to convey to our elected officials is that they are not helping veterans either by being complicit in allowing these wars to continue. A far higher threshold or level for patriotism is to challenge what the military is doing to ensure that military service of the service members that you hold so dearly is not being misused. And Congress has basically abdicated their war powers, which is deeply troubling.
Accompanying one of your pieces for Politico on this point of how this resonates with leaders is a picture of you with both of the Obamas at Arlington. And it's, to me, an unsettling picture. Can you talk us through that moment and how that meeting came to be and what you felt in that moment meeting a president who was sending people to war?
And where you were standing when the photograph was taken, if you would.
Yeah. So the background on that is while I was deployed in one of our sister battalions, one of my very close friends, his name is Tyler Parton, and Tyler was killed within the first 3 or so months of that deployment. He was killed September 10th, 2009, and I know that because it was one day before September 11th. And I recall, being in Kandahar and getting a very urgent and emotional call from his then girlfriend. And I couldn't make out what she was saying. The internet at the fob was so entirely bad that I couldn't make it out. But I knew that she was crying. And I only could think that something terrible had happened. And, calling her back, I hear this sort of airline boarding announcements while she's getting ready to go fly to, potentially a funeral service for one of my very close friends, and her explaining that he had been shot to death on a barren mountain escarpment in Konar, or I believe it was, or Nangarhar, I think it is. And from that point, their family cremated Tyler, and they weren't entirely sure what they were going to do with his remains and find an adequate resting place. And upon completion of that deployment, I served in the Honor Guard in Washington, D.C., where part of my role was serving as the presidential escort platoon leader during the Obama administration. So I saw President Obama for any of these sorts of large, wreath-laying ceremonies at Arlington National Cemetery or on the White House lawn. And it was actually complete circumstance and serendipity that I chose to go again to Arlington National Cemetery, Section 60, on the day before September 11th in 2011. And I had actually buried Tyler personally. So as part of the Honor Guard, I buried one of my closest friends from West Point and handed the folded American flag to his crying mother. And then a year or so later, the president comes a day before September 11th to pay his respects at the cemetery. And he walks directly over to me, and we start up a conversation about Tyler's life. And it was both. I could hold these things in my hands at the same time. On the one hand, I found that this was incredibly endearing, and I appreciated it in his sort of candor and bedside manner, both for him and the First Lady, was appropriate. And yet, on the other hand, here is a guy who scaled up drone warfare, who committed to the surge, which was why soldiers like myself were there in Afghanistan, and part of the reason why soldiers like Tyler were killed. So you have these sort of conflicting feelings. I think overall, it was a nice thing to do, but it's downstream nice. It's something bad has happened based on a terrible upstream decision made strategically by a president, several presidents in a row, and then doing nice things after people have been broken isn't the answer. The answer is to go upstream and stop making those terrible decisions that breaks people in the first place. And our country has not figured out how to do that.
We're talking to Eric Edstrom. His book is Un-American: A Soldier's Reckoning of Our Longest War, and his latest piece for Politico magazine is Catching the Last Flight Out of Afghanistan. We want to talk about that for a minute. Most of America believe that we should get out of this longest war. Most of America also thought that the exit was, I think chaotic is probably a euphemism. And we all know, well, I don't know how many, if we knew as many people as you suggest were left behind, allies, former coworkers, interpreters, etc. But you make the point in your most recent point in Politico magazine, Eric Edstrom, that the effort to get remaining people out, and you suggest it could be in the tens and tens of thousands, is essentially become a volunteer effort of former veterans like you, and not one of our government. Why is that?
Well, our government has abdicated any sort of responsibility to taking care of our Afghan allies, and it's a deep national embarrassment, not only in my mind, but in the mind of many other veterans who are supporting these efforts. To go one step back, the U.S. government could have done some capacity planning and thought about this earlier when we had control of all of these airfields and bases, and matched the supply of people that we should evacuate safely with the with aircraft. We did not do that, and so we created a singular choke point at Kabul, where our allies were having to traverse the entire country with Taliban-controlled roads and a choke point that they couldn't get through. And when America withdrew, all of the politicians that had this sudden wave of inspiration to care about Afghan allies, the same ones like, for instance, Congressman Lynch, who I reached out to in 2017 and went to his office to talk about this exact issue at Rayburn House. In those 4 years, what has he done? The answer is nothing about this issue. We have not increased capacity of the State Department to process the 20,000 principal applicants that are still being left behind. So there's a huge backlog that's not being addressed. We could do categorical humanitarian parole, where we allow people to leave the country and go to a third-party lily pad where they could be processed, ultimately arriving in the United States. That hasn't been done either. So it has been left truly on the shoulders of volunteers to scrape together hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions of dollars, to charter flights, to work with the State Department, effectively doing the business of the federal government, because our federal government has failed so incredibly poorly, or so incredibly badly.
Well, we hope in a minute you'll tell us the story of getting your translator out, who you call Rock in your piece. But before we do that, this may be an incredibly naive question, so I apologize in advance. If the government our government doesn't want to be in this business, and you and your fellow vets are in the business as volunteers trying to raise money, why don't they at minimum fund you? Like Jared and I were talking before, like they fund contractors, for example, in places like Afghanistan and Iraq. Why can't they fund your, quote, volunteer efforts if they're not going to do them themselves when they publicly make the commitment, including the president himself, that we're going to get everybody out eventually who wants to get out?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, that commitment's a complete farce. There's about, at current rates, you could estimate that about 2,000 people are maybe getting out by airlines today. So if you take 2,000 people out a month, it would be 5+ years until the job is complete. And donor money is already getting exhausted. So sure, the federal government could fund us, but I mean, frankly, this should be done by the federal government. We shouldn't need volunteers for this effort. And for the federal government, this is a pittance. To throw out, let's just say, $50 million as a generous estimate to charter the aircraft required to move these tens of thousands of people to safety and fulfill our moral obligation to take care of their lives after they served our interests in their country during our war, that's very cheap from the perspective of the government. And I would hope that they do arrange these aircraft, but I'm not seeing an appetite to do that.
I'm sorry. I'm still not quite clear, though, why. Forget why they're not funding your efforts. Why are they not doing it?
I mean, that's a great question, but we could ask why many times, going up the chain of why did we not plan to exfil appropriately? Why were we in Afghanistan for 20 years in a negative-sum war? There's many questions of why upstream of this as well. And the answer is poor planning and bad leadership.
Well, Eric Edstrom, to explain why the funds that volunteers are raising are being so rapidly depleted, can you walk us through the efforts it's taken you to get the translator that you worked with for so long, who's called Rock? You're not using his real identity, obviously. We know how many people have been killed already for being identified by the Taliban for helping the U.S. and its allies over the years. But what have you been able to do for him so far, and how difficult was it?
Yeah, I mean, before the U.S. removed the air bridge in Kabul and shut down our presence there, Rock made a big move by leaving his hometown and traveling across the country, hoping that he would get out on a flight. In the first phase of these volunteer efforts, in the primary evacuation phase, volunteers comprised of former veterans, intel analysts, active duty folks as well on these same threads who probably are doing this covertly because the U.S. military would not necessarily approve of their role in helping to, evacuate our allies and using, what they know in support of that. So first phase is trying to get people through the gates of Hamid Karzai International Airport and coordinating that. And that involved quite tactical detail about which gate is open at what time, processing which category of visa. There was basically no signage at Hamid Karzai International Airport to even allow the huge masses of crowds awareness as to which gate is open and what type of visas they're processing. So people stand around all day long at this choke point, creating an environment ripe for a suicide bomber as it happened. The State Department refused to work with Google, which actually was planning to use some identification apps to make this process better, which could have probably also helped. And in this second phase of work, in the sort of secondary evacuation, now that the U.S. has left, volunteers are basically trying to cobble together money, create manifests that then are sent to the State Department for approval. So then they are being added to charter flights. They organize buses to get people to remote airports. They are flown out to third-party lily pad countries where they also have to get approval. The humanitarian conditions in some of these places are absolutely abysmal, especially during the primary evac phase. I think things are getting a little bit better now. And for Rock, this is exactly how it happened. There's a lot of false starts. He was hiding in a safe house, which for the volunteers, if you're housing thousands and thousands of allies, keeping them safe, that's the tune of sort of $20, $30 a day for hotel and food. And then per seat, you're talking about $750K to charter a flight that has 300 seats on it. So there's an operating burn rate associated with housing and keeping people out of the Taliban-controlled streets. And then there's a much larger lump sum payment associated with the cost of chartering the flights. Both of those are problematic. The volunteer organizations are running out of money. And soon, if they don't get adequate funding, thousands of people are going to be ejected onto the streets. And I regularly get videos and photographs of murdered Afghan commandos, people that are being hung from vehicles and driven through town. And that is a regular occurrence for what I get to see transmitted directly from Afghanistan to my phone.
Do you think we've learned anything from this war, or we'll just do it again and again when the opportunity arises?
I mean, I certainly hope so. Past experience tells me no. I think some of this is sort of complicated in the sense of American culture turns a blind eye towards what the military is doing instead of a much more critical eye. The military is very different than other forms of public service. And I say that because if you're a teacher and you become better at teaching, presumably the community is better off. If you're a firefighter, the same applies. But if you're a soldier and your job is to shoot people in the face and occupy another country, you have to be very sure that what the military is doing when it comes to political violence is the right thing. And rarely does the U.S. actually use its forces for causes related to the protection of the national territory. It's always offensive. And we create a tremendous humanitarian catastrophe in the countries that we occupy. So have we learned? I mean, looking back from Vietnam till now, the answer is no. I think that we need a complete overhaul in the way that the U.S. thinks about its relationship with the military in order for some sort of renaissance of thinking to happen in this space.
Eric Edstrom, I really hope you'll join us again soon. Your writing is incredible, and we're so glad you spent some time with us today. Thanks for your time.
Thank you very much for having me.
Appreciate it.
Thank you for being with us. Eric Edstrom was born and raised in Stoughton. He graduated from West Point, was deployed to Afghanistan as an infantry officer. He's also a senior fellow at the Eisenhower Media Network. His latest book is Un-American, A Soldier's Reckoning of Our Longest War. Coming up, we're going to open up the lines to ask you about what we can and should do as Americans to be more fully engaged Americans. That's next on Boston Public Radio.
Welcome back to Boston Public Radio. Jared Bowen sitting in for Marjorie. I'm Jim Browdy. Following that rather incredible conversation we just had with Afghanistan veteran Eric Edstrom, we're going to open the lines to talk about the disconnect so many Americans experience between the comforts of life at home and the realities of U.S. military interventions overseas. In that piece that we were referencing that he wrote for Politico, that was back in May, Eric wrote, when it comes to our military, the mantra of the public has become, this is so perfect, has become thank, don't think. You know that thank you for your service thing? That's me speaking, not him. To most Americans, insulated from its effects, war is elevator music. So we heard what Eric Edstrom had to say. We're going to open up the lines and hear what you have to say. We are insulated from war, but Jared and I would argue we're also insulated from any real obligation to our country or to be engaged. From time to time, Marjorie and I talk about a pet project of mine. It's not military, required military service, but required service for, let's say, everybody at age 18 in a civilian sector effort to do something for their communities or other communities, not just because America needs it, but because at least I believe that it would lead to greater engagement and a greater recognition of the obligation we have to be engaged citizens in this country. We want to know what you think at 877-301-8970. The notion would be this: you turn 18 years old, you're required essentially, you got to take a year off from whatever path you've decided for yourself to enter the real world, meet people who aren't like you. You know, you've grown up in whatever silo most of us grow up in. Serve in communities unlike yours. Do something that matters to that community. You have a feeling of accomplishment in terms of your country, your neighboring cities. That sort of. I think it is so important. It would do so much to change the attitudes of young people coming into adulthood in this country. And particularly when that line will stay with me, thank, don't think. If I hear from, another congressperson who has done nothing to protect the men and women who have chosen to serve this country, that you're in our thoughts and prayers, and then thank you for your service when they don't mean it in the slightest. It, as he says, it gives you an opportunity to do something other than think. 877-301-8097. What do you think about mandatory? I know I've done it with Marjorie a lot of times. I don't know if you've ever done it with you. What do you think about it?
I absolutely agree with it because I think in the end it's all about empathy and exposure.
Yeah.
I often think about, so I've spent about a third of my career covering the arts. The rest was covering news. And I say this often, that gave me the opportunity for all the myriad news stories I covered over the years. It put me into people's homes, into different settings, having conversations. Granted, as journalists, we go in and out. It's not like we're living, it's not like we're embedded. But I think that traveling around, and really for me, fundamentally, it was always being in other people's homes that gave me a fuller understanding of society and who people are and how people live and how people think, and understanding why they think the way they do. And I think what you're talking about gives people an opportunity to do something like that, to break out of your bubble, be forced to be in a different situation, and come away with an understanding that hopefully will carry you through the rest of your life.
Yeah, and you feel close to your country, and you feel like a greater sense of ownership. So maybe when your Congress decides to send men and women into endless wars, or what become endless wars, you might feel an obligation, or at least empowered, to speak up, and maybe in support, maybe in opposition. You know what I'm thinking about when you're talking too, which obviously is new. You read that study, I'm sure we talked about on the air. David Scharfenberg wrote about it in the Globe, that social mobility story that the guy from Harvard, Sampson, wrote, that essentially we not only are segregated in Boston and a lot of major American cities in terms of where we live, but where we travel, what our daily travel lives are like. And that allows all of us who are somewhat siloed to break out of those and, as you say, experience things other than ourselves that we're used to, and maybe should develop some empathy, which so many of us seem to have lost or never had in recent times. In any case, we want to know what you think about mandatory, I call it civilian service, meaning non-military service for people when they turn 18 in this country. Let's start in Marblehead with Lauren. Lauren, thank you for calling, and we appreciate it. Hi, Lauren.
Hi, good afternoon.
Hey.
I just could not agree with you more.
Wow.
I think that is just the best idea. Yes, it gets people out of their bubbles, especially the more entitled bubbles that we tend to circulate through. Gives people insight and perspective in terms of making decisions moving forward. And also just a greater appreciation of what you might have or not have, or might have over others. I always knew I was a lucky kid growing up for so many reasons, primarily because I had the most amazing parents. Mm-hmm. But it wasn't until I worked in a hospital I really saw all the real world, every A to Z that comes through those doors. So I 200% agree with you guys. I love it.
Beautifully put. Lauren, thank you for the call. The first experience for me was when I worked in the South Bronx as a legal service lawyer. I was 24 at the time. I hadn't experienced much outside of my little world in Philadelphia, and all of a sudden, I would like to think that I am a better person because of those 7 years in the South Bronx than I was before, and I'd probably be an even better person. I know what you're all thinking out there. Don't say it. If I had done it at 18. And I know people don't like forced anything in this country. I know that, listen, we've lived through the masks and the vaccinations and this sort of thing. But Eric Edstrom Peace really struck a chord with me. I knew it before, but he said it so beautifully. We don't give a damn about any of these things. You know, we say it, and you see a guy or a woman in a military outfit, and you probably say that thank thing. But we don't do a damn thing to affect these kinds of decisions.
Well, and that phrase that he uses, the war is like elevator music. I mean, how true is that? It's wallpaper on the news, in magazines. We just see pictures, you flip the page, you move on, you click through, you scroll down, you move on, and then you sit and hear, the 20-minute conversation that we just had with him, and you can hear it in his voice, what he experienced. And for me, that's why I've never been able to completely say thank you for your service, because it feels like such a trite thing to say for somebody who has experienced such horror, and that. It's not that I'm not thankful for their service, but it just feels it's not enough to say it feels.
We didn't have time to go into one of the incredible stories he tells about this guy A.J. Nelson, who served under him. A couple of weeks in his time in Afghanistan, the guy gets injured. He's worried he's going to die, and his commanding officer, who was Edstrom, says, "Don't worry, you're going to be okay." He says, "I have no idea what I meant when I said it, but I said it." He is the guy who ended up coming back and murdering people and becoming a convicted murderer who is now in jail for life. And you can, I think, make a causal connection argument that one of the reasons those things happen is because we sort of blithely go about our business and don't think. Stephen Braintree, hi.
Hi, Steve.
Hi, how you doing?
Good.
I agree with what you're saying about service. I was just speaking to the person on the line before I got through to you, saying that it is implicit in American society when a citizen says to a military individual, "Thank you for your service." It's obvious what they're saying because they're speaking to a military individual, but anywhere else, a conversation like that isn't. It's implicit here that it's to do with the military, but it isn't implicit anywhere else. So the service in America is the military, and a vet is a military veteran. A vet, where I come from, is somebody who treats animals. You would have to explain that and go further to go on to say what service you were talking about or what kind of vet you were talking about, because war has become so unfortunately very normalized in American society, and as you were saying, we are terribly insulated from it, from such absolute horror that should never be normal at all.
Another perfect phone call. Steve, thank you for making it. Appreciate it. 877-301-8970.
The other thing is, how often have we said that it's so easy to say something or send a message, do something online, but once you're face-to-face with somebody, it's an entirely different conversation. Well, why is that? Because you're suddenly having an understanding. You're having a conversation, and you have to be, for the most part, if you're a normal human being, I think you have to be empathetic when you're having a conversation directly with someone, and you, of course, take that all away with you. Let's next go to Jake in the car. Hi, Jake.
Hello, Jake.
Hey there.
Hey.
So I'm talking from a point of view of being maybe a little bit closer to the age at 23, and no offense to you or you guys.
Yeah, you're a little closer than me. A little closer, Jake. Go ahead.
A little closer. Splitting hairs. So I was just going to say that, so I was a Boy Scout. I did quite a bit of community service through that. I was an Eagle Scout. And my one issue with the idea of conscripted service is that I think it loses its meaning slightly if people are forced into it. My high school forced everyone to do community service. You were supposed to do 10 hours a year. Most of the kids just worked as hard as they could to find somebody who would sign off on their community service without having done the work. I just don't think that whenever you're forced into it, that you'll take the same meaningful approach to it, that it just won't mean as much if you don't choose to do it.
Jake, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Jared.
Well, if I could just push back a little bit, Jake, I mean, is that part of the point is to yes, I hear what you're saying, but you also want to get people out of their comfort zone. And so maybe it's more an issue of finding something that's more aligned with what they could do outside of their comfort zone. But unless you're urged to do it, you'll never find it, right?
I think that's true to a degree, that we should probably push people to do more service and maybe make it a bigger part of society of people doing service. But I think that if everybody, it's sort of, if everyone's a veteran, if everyone's served, if everyone's not necessarily served in the military, but if everyone's served for public office, I think that more so just dilutes the meaning behind what it means to have served rather than increases an appreciation for it. It makes people feel like they would have more, feel like people would use it as like, oh, well, I served and I can speak on it and things like that, even if they were, drastically different experiences.
Jake, since we're almost exactly the same age, let me respond to a couple things you have said. I happen to agree with you. It is better to have, in a perfect world, to have people volunteer than be forced. This is an imperfect world. And to put what Jared said in a slightly different fashion, those who would volunteer, I would argue, are those who need it least. And those who wouldn't volunteer are those who need it most. And I would like to think that the correct observation you make about people not being as into it when they're forced would start to dissipate over time, not just for the individuals, but over time, meaning in year 2, year 3, year 10, it became normalized. The notion was you in this country have an obligation to give something back. And so, again, while I agree with your observation, I think over time it becomes overcome by the good and the benefit. But we really appreciate your perspective, and thank you for calling. 877-301-8970. I've spoken through the years, because this is one of my many obsessions, to tons of members of Congress about this, particularly local ones. And everybody, by the way, not for thoughtful reasons like Jake has suggested, support a voluntary notion. But again, don't you agree with me? It's like the people you're trying to draw out of their cell are the people who are least likely to say, I'm going to volunteer for this.
Absolutely.
And it's just because nobody likes to force anybody to do anything, but you have an obligation in this country. I think you have an obligation to vote. Most of us don't. Look at Boston, don't meet that obligation. And you have an obligation to give something back to your country and hopefully become a more engaged citizen. I think this is the way to do it.
Next on line is Alice, calling from Barrington, Rhode Island. Hi, Alice.
Hello, Alice.
Hi.
Hi.
I just wanted to come in and touch base about the whole thank you, not thank you thing. And I've not read Eric's book, but I plan to. My husband is a vet from Iraq War with 100% disability for PTSD, and it's been a horrible experience. But I've lost a lot of friends because of this cheap grace, we call it, you know, and this veterans, some of his pals from the Army who get so angry that people are kneeling at the national anthem at sports events, and it means nothing to what my husband Seth has done. You know, he served so that people could do that, and they want to stand there and put their hand on their heart and say thank you, but I don't know. Do they? I just, it's really kind of sickening, and it's just disheartening, and I just wanted to say I can relate, I guess.
Well, I know I speak for Jared. I can't thank you enough for calling and sharing your life experience, Alice. We really appreciate it. Thank you for that. 877-301-8970. Cheap grace. That's a hell of an expression that really sort of captures it. I'll tell you. You know, it sort of reminds me when she says that, one of the things that totally puts me over the edge when we were talking to Eric Edstrom about these endless authorizations for military force that are used for everything. I think he says the one in 2001 after 9/11 has been used, I think he said 41 different times without Congress having to engage at those State of the Union things when there's always at least one military person sitting in the First Lady's box, and the members of Congress who will never stand up for anything that is celebrated by the other side. They have to sit and then they're like Jack in the box as soon as something 100% stand up with thunderous, endless applause, essentially to cover for the lack of any action to protect the lives of her husband. And it's so cheap. It is just, we have time for one more. Let's take it. Pat in Rhode Island. Welcome. Thank you for calling.
Hi. I've got a son who's at the Naval Academy right now.
Oh.
And I totally agree with you on that Americans should be giving back to the country that's provided for them. But I don't see that you'll ever get it through when you can't even get people to wear masks.
No, that's a very
to
good
protect
point.
each other, let alone, giving of their time and of their effort. I think, I don't know how you do it, but we need to ingrain a value of service. You saw it during the pandemic that the people who served that were essential. We pay them minimum wage. They're not given respect. Somehow we need to find a way to value each other and to support each other. That's the only way. That's when we move forward the best in this country, is when we support each other.
Pat, did you hear Eric Edstrom with us a half hour ago?
I heard the tail end. I got the very end of, that. I'll tell you, when my son decided to go to a service academy, I grew up, I was born in 1961, and I remember as a little girl seeing the body counts. I didn't have a great respect for the military because I didn't see them as making decisions in the best interest of the country. That, it seemed to me that military were a disposable resource. So I was kind of torn when he decided, to go in. But I totally respect his patriotism and his willing to sacrifice for others. I wish that that caller, the wife of the soldier.
Yeah, the guy who's got 100% disability for PTSD.
Yeah. Yep. I don't think. When you say thank you for your service, you don't realize that when they step into combat, they are never the same. They all give a piece of them, at least a piece of themselves that never comes back, the same.
Pat, your son is lucky to have you. Thank you very much for the call. Boy, that was pretty incredible. Thank you.
Yeah, if only we could make it happen. And
No, she's right.
Maybe even the youngest age isn't the time to do it. That's the other thing. I'm thinking about that last caller who said so many people will do anything to get out of it because you don't have probably enough life experience. This would give you the life experience, but you don't have the value. You don't understand the value of what you'd be doing. Up next, a conversation with the chef and owner of Somerville's award-winning restaurant Sarma. Cassie Pua is next. Keep your dial on 89.7 GBH Boston Public Radio.
Welcome back to Boston Public Radio. I am Jim Browdy. Jared Bowen is sitting in for Marjorie. Our next guest has been a James Beard nominee for Best Chef in the Northeast just 5 times in the last 6 years. Cassie Puma is the chef and owner of Sarma in Somerville. Her place was just ranked #1 restaurant in Boston by Boston Magazine, and I'm sure by tons of other lucky diners. Cassie, congratulations. It's great to talk to you as always.
Thanks, Jim. It's great to be here.
And hello to meet Jared Bowen.
Hey, Jared. Nice to meet you.
Such a pleasure to be speaking with you. So we'll talk more about everything that you've been doing and all of the acclaim that's coming your way in a moment. But first, we're wondering how you have made it through the last 2 years. You have made it, which is a great success because we know it's been very, very difficult. But what have you come to understand about yourself, the business?
Quite a lot, actually. First and foremost, I'm really just grateful, like you said, that the lights are still on, that we're still around. It's been a challenge, I mean, for everyone. And it continues to be a challenge, but, there's light at the end of the tunnel now, and I think things are kind of moving forward. We have an incredible staff, which we're really fortunate to have, some of whom have been with us for many years. And then, along the way, we had some great additions, even through the pandemic, which was incredible. And I think together, what we've all realized is the importance of the team. And that without, an incredible team and, a thoughtful team, there's not much that can be done. Even, it's not a one-man gig. It's everybody kind of working together. So I think that's what we've really, really noticed.
You sound totally calm, but were there moments in that 20 months where you said, I'm not sure we can do this?
Oh, yeah. Yes. I think when I was coming home from work in the heart of the pandemic and stripping my clothes off at the front door, so I didn't get my kids sick.
Sure.
I was a little panicked at that time and wondering, what the hell are we going to do here? How are we going to keep going on like this? But, I think like anything, you just take it one day at a time, and you really have to like look inside yourself and pull out that strength and just be like, hey, this is a restaurant. Restaurants always have challenges. Something is always going wrong. Something is always breaking. Something is always wacky and haywire. And it's like, this is just yet another thing that we have to deal with, and we have to kind of think outside the box and figure it out and find a solution.
I've been to your places, a lot of times. Jared, of course, can't get a reservation. We feel bad for Jared.
Oh my goodness! But Jared, I'll help you.
But when I first read that you were doing takeout and we ordered, I don't even know why I thought this, but I figured you're the person. I said to myself, but Sarma's not a takeout kind of place. It's not the kind of food is not what I would expect to be takeout sub. And of course it was great. We did it. Did you wonder whether or not you could be a takeout kind of place?
Absolutely. I mean, we are not a takeout kind of place. And, I actually, before the pandemic, you'll find this amusing. I used to have a very strict rule that we would never do takeout.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Even the poor servers who would be like waiting on these tables, they would be like, these guests would like to take food home. And I'd be like, no, they just sat here for,
Why?
2 hours and had a nice meal and they want to bring something home. And I'd be like, no.
Why, Cassie?
Because I thought the experience was going to like fail for people. Like, it wasn't going to live up to their expectations. It's, it's not cheap. It's not expensive, but it's not cheap either. And to like, to spend that kind of money on food, you want to make sure that it's like, the best possible quality that you can provide for somebody. And, when it's sitting in a box and it's steaming and it's, doing whatever it does in that little to-go box, it's not going to be the best possible product. And I always wish that for people, that they can have a good experience. But that being said, with the pandemic, we had to make changes. And that was a big part of, the experiment was like, how can we come up with delicious food that represents who we are, that's going to travel well and make people happy and bring them some comfort at home. And that was a project, and we did it. And I think I hope we did it well. I didn't eat too much of the food at home myself, so I can't really say, but I think for the most part, people were pretty happy just to have, like I said, a little bit of that comfort and a little something different, some spice, and something reminiscent of their dining experiences at Sarma in their own home.
Well, Cassie, I read that you had this pretty elaborate test involving a lot of time and a microwave to ensure that your food was okay for takeout.
Okay, that was kind of true. I did test some stuff. Every now and again, I would bring some dishes home and I'd like let them sit on my counter for 30, 40 minutes and just let them die a slow death. And then I would put them in the microwave and do what I think like a person at home would do, like put it on for way too long. And then I would let it sit for like another 10 minutes and then I would eat it. And if I didn't, grow up, then it was ready to go.
It's a hell of an endorsement. We're talking to Cassie Puma from Sarma in Somerville. So fast forward to current events. I was going to say post-pandemic. It's obviously not post-pandemic, but at this stage of the pandemic, where obviously it's less of a horror show than it once was, how are things at Sarma?
I mean, I think, again, we still have our struggles here and there, and every day is like kind of a different picture, but we are moving towards something that I think resembles, what we're more accustomed to. And we've gone through all the motions. We did breakfast, we did lunch, we opened a patio, we did takeout. And as things move forward, what I'm trying to do is get back to a place that really represents who we are and just kind of simplify things. And, as the indoor dining, we're allowed to have, back to our capacity, our normal capacity. I'd like to just focus on indoor dining because that's really what we love to do and that's what we do best. And so that's kind of where we're headed. With the chillier temps outside, we're getting ready to close up our patio. I know a lot of folks continue to like to eat out there, and I'm so grateful for everyone who is like, just strongly braved the cold temps and the windy nights and the rainy nights and all that. But I think for the most part, especially for our staff too, it's more comfortable for people to dine inside during this climate. And so we're trying to move it in and just kind of focus on doing one thing really well.
Cassie Puma, I want to talk about indoor dining when the pandemic's still here. We know in New York City under Mayor de Blasio, there's a requirement to get in a performance venue or a restaurant. You got to be fully vaxxed. We had Michelle Wu with us a couple of days before the election, and I asked her if, as mayor, she would require that every Boston restaurant and performance venue require that the patrons show that they were fully vaccinated. She said yes. You have not made that choice. And by the way, the vast majority of restaurants in Greater Boston, as you know better than I, have not made that choice. Why?
Well, let's see. I mean, it's very, I'm going to start with this. It's a very personal decision. And I think everybody, I kind of respect what everybody's doing. I get it across the board. For us, the majority, I would say probably 98, 99% of our staff is vaccinated. And we're fortunate to be in the city of Somerville, which is, as we all know, a very progressive city. And I think the majority of our patrons are vaccinated or at least take the virus very seriously. Somerville continues to issue an indoor mask mandate. We do our best to social distance. So we've kind of across the board just been lucky. I don't want to say it's not on my radar, but, it hasn't been like a serious concern for us because we don't see a huge need right now. And I also kind of think, in my humble opinion, that it should kind of come from the top. If it is going to be, mandated through the city, then of course that's something that we would, oblige. But I think that it needs to come from the top. I think it's a lot to put on the individual, restaurants that are at this point in time just trying to keep the lights on.
Sure.
So tell us about your food, and I'm curious about your travels and how that may have informed how you've arrived at your blend and what you create at Sarma.
It kind of comes from all over, to be honest. I grew up in, my dad is Greek, so I grew up in a sort of like a Greek American household. Ate a lot of feta cheese and olives and lamb and all that good stuff growing up. So that's kind of like, I always joke around that my blood is like 75% feta cheese, olive oil.
I wish mine was.
Me
I'll
too.
tell you.
So I grew up with that palate, and then I was very fortunate to work at a restaurant, I'm sure Oleana in Cambridge, for the better part of a decade. I think it was close to 12 years, 11 or 12 years, and I worked with Anna Sortun, and she is the queen of all things Eastern Mediterranean, and I learned so much. It's hard to even really put into words what the knowledge I gained there, and I just tried to pick up, like absorb every little part of her and that restaurant that I could. And, I think moving forward, I traveled a lot when I was there with Anna. We went to all kinds of cool places. And then I did a lot of traveling on my own with my husband. We loved to travel. Before we had kids, we were everywhere. Less so now these days, but a lot of traveling. And then if I'm have a spare moment that does not have to do with cooking or taking care of kids, I basically have my nose in a cookbook. So I try to research a lot and just pretend like I'm in these different places, experiencing these things, even if I can't be in the moment. And I really absorb a lot that way. And then mostly I think it's just like your creative process. I mean, I'm easily inspired. I can go to McDonald's and get inspired by a Whopper or I don't know, whatever it is there. But I get easily inspired by things around me, and I just try to take it all and put it together, just cram it together. And then the best part, at this point in my career is working with really incredible people. I've, been fortunate, like I said, to have this incredible staff who, some of whom have grown with us over the past 8 years. And, they bring all their different experiences and their cultures and their travels to the restaurant as well. And it's just like, we all kind of work together, we bounce ideas off each other, and you really can learn something new, all the time.
Well, you've somewhat just answered a question I've always wanted to ask a chef and realize I just haven't. I'm always fascinated by process, and given the life that you have, especially being a mom on top of everything and being as busy as you are running a restaurant, how do you have to carve out the time to experiment, or is it more things that just marinate with you? You're leaving leaving a McDonald's and just driving and thinking, oh, wait a minute, well, this would work. How do you make your process work for invention and experimentation?
It used to be so much more specific. Like I did used to really carve time out for myself and really try to focus. Like I would come home from work late at night and I would open up my books and I'd have my papers out, my computer on, and I would really take that time to focus. But now I'm lucky if I can, stay awake at the end of service. So I do try to just find the little moments in between. Like I kid around a lot that the best ideas come to me in the shower. It's just any moment of just solitude and solace and quiet that I can have. I try to just focus my brain on things. And like I said, just paying attention to the process around you, looking at things, I'm not really a trendy person, but just, paying attention to the trends, even Instagram for all its trouble. You can pop on Instagram these days and just see pictures, and sometimes somebody else's, vision can just get your brain moving. And that's all it takes sometimes, is seeing a visual of something to get the juices flowing.
By the way, just like you, I often have my greatest inspirations when I'm eating a Whopper in the shower. It's amazing how that... When was the last time, Cassie Puma, that you ate a Whopper, really?
Oh, geez. I haven't had a Whopper in a long time, but there's a Wendy's that's right next to... I shouldn't be admitting this out loud. I'm a little embarrassed, but there's a Wendy's near the supermarket and the Target that I frequent every Monday to go, my weekly food shopping thing. And sometimes, it hits the spot, I gotta say.
We're all human, you know what I mean? We're talking to Cassie Puma from Sarma and Somerville. How's this, you've mentioned, I love when restaurateurs talk about how they feel about their workers, and it's just, and you say it in such a tender kind of way. I really love it. But every restaurateur we've spoken to over the past 20 months has talked about the obvious, how impossible it's been to keep a staff not just safe, but much more importantly, working. How hard has it been for you to staff your place?
Well, I'll say this. I've always tried to be sort of proactive about staffing. I know it ends up costing us, from a labor perspective, a lot more. But I try to stay on top of it. So I hire people before I actually am in need of someone, before we're all dying a slow death. So I try to stay on top of it. So for that reason, I feel like I've been okay, but even now, like trying to do that is impossible. It is so hard to find not just even great people, just any people who would like to work. And it's like I have ads running on my on sites for months and months before anyone even responds to them, which is a little disheartening. But what is great is that I am fortunate to have a very devoted team who, again, many of them have been there for years and years and have they've just gone to battle for Sarma, and I'm so grateful, because it's just you really depend on these folks to make the day happen, and without it, like I said, you only have two hands and you can only go so far. So I think it comes down to really, number one, respecting your team, trying to be as open-minded and communicative as you possibly can. I mean, everyone's kind of coming from a different perspective and they have different needs, but just trying to listen to people and find out what it is that they are looking for and do your best to honor it. I think just treating people like human beings and, open communication is the number one way. Also, I think a work-life balance is really important to a lot of people these days, that I've come up with. And if you're like, hey, all we have is A, B, and C, and you can't work with folks, then it's not going to work for you either. I think it's in everyone's best interest to try to help people find that balance in their life. And also, the third thing is the pay scale. It's been kind of cruddy for, a good chunk of time. And I think, restaurants, especially through the pandemic, found a way, I don't want to call it a loophole necessarily, but we found ways to increase people's pay without killing the restaurant, because the margins, and I know you've heard it, the margins are incredibly slim. And, we found different ways. We've tacked on, these administrative fees, kitchen appreciation, people call it different things, to the bill. And most people are pretty amicable about them, but it's, what it does is that money goes directly to the staff, and it's something on top of their regular salary that they can, take home. And I think that's really helping people, afford to live in a city that's just growing and growing and growing, and the inflation is growing. And I think it's helping people out a lot.
Yeah, I want to ask you a quick question about that fee. I've had this discussion here in real life this is sort of real life, with some of your colleagues. Why do you choose to supplement wages that way rather than just raising the price of things? Yeah. Why that decision?
Quite frankly, we've had to do that too. Mm-hmm. We've had to do all of it. The price of goods is astronomical right now, but we do occasionally raise the prices. There is only so far we can go, especially at Sarma. I mean, they're small plates. I mean, you can only, reasonably charge so much for, a plate of Brussels sprouts. But I think what's good about the administrative fee is that, if you just raise the prices, that money can go anywhere in the restaurant world that you can imagine. There's so many different pockets that we're spending, and it's like, when you start struggling or at the end of the month things are tight or whatever, you use whatever you can use to make it work. But I think with this specific administrative fee, it's a very honest, very clear, very transparent way to tell the guests, this is where your money is going. It's going directly. We are taking this percentage. We do not touch a penny of it, and it gets distributed equally amongst every single one of our staff, from the folks in the kitchen to I'm sorry, I need to clarify that. It goes to everyone in the back of the house. Mm-hmm. So anyone from cooks, chefs, dishwashers, but it's equally distributed amongst them. And, I think that it's a bit more honest that way.
So, in addition to feeling those pressures of running a business, I wonder about the pressure you feel with all of the acclaim that's come your way, the recognition by James Beard, Boston Magazine, proclaiming you best restaurant, the number one restaurant. And then, as Jim mentioned at the outset, it is hard to get reservations at your restaurant. So that people are clamoring. Do you feel the weight of that, or have you reached a point in your career where there's a certain level of confidence you have to know how people are looking at you and what they would expect?
Do you guys think that Boston Magazine was ranked?
Well,
that's my first question. I don't know. I'm not entirely sure. I think we might have lucked out and just, we kind of they categorized it a little bit differently this year than they have in the past. And
that's like nip. I mean, the reality is they're saying you're either, if it's not ranked, you're one of the extraordinary restaurants. And there have been a ton of other, as you know, reviews of Boston restaurants where you have been at the top. So I think you're being modest, but yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I try to there's so many great places, and there really are, and there's so many interesting new places that are popping up, and I am, no matter what it was, or I'm truly honored, and I know my team is really honored to even be on that list and amongst those incredible restaurants. And it's just we're not old, but we're not new either. We've been around for 8 years, and it's just it's incredible just to kind of still be cool, to be relevant and still in the mix. And again, I'm very honored. I know everybody works so hard, and I want to see them rewarded for that hard work, because it's being in a restaurant can feel, sometimes, especially in the back of the house, it can feel a little thankless sometimes. You're just kind of cooking tickets, and it can become monotonous, and you're like, what am I working towards? What am I doing? And you're not always in the front of the house where you can see reactions and you can see people smiling and nodding their heads and saying yeah, this is great, or whatever. You don't see that back there. So the recognition is nice because it allows people the opportunity to be okay, we're doing something good. People like us, and I'm really happy for everyone that they can feel that, because it feels good for me to feel that. Again, chefs can be, kind of self-deprecating. It's you come up with a beautiful dish, and the next minute you hate it, You're I hate myself. I hate this dish.
Well,
so it's nice to feel good.
Cassie, before you go, speaking of incredible restaurants, your term, it actually gives people hope. For those who have been trying to get a reservation and keep trying and ultimately, keep hope alive, while you're waiting, you can always get a Dave's Triple at Wendy's, and then ultimately you get into Sarma. Hey, Cassie, whatever number you're ranked, congratulations. Sarma is fabulous, as everybody knows, and we really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Jim. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure.
Thank you so much. Cassie Puma is a multi-time James Beard nominee for Best Chef in the Northeast. She's a chef and owner of Sarma in Somerville, which was named Boston's best restaurant by Boston Magazine. Well, coming up, we're opening up our phone lines once again to ask you about how you're navigating the work-life balance, and if you'd like to see the U.S. follow in Portugal's footsteps, which is banning bosses from reaching out after hours. That's ahead on Boston Public Radio.
Welcome back to Boston Public Radio. Jared Bowen sitting in for Marjorie. I'm Jim Browdy. We're opening the lines to continue a conversation we briefly had earlier in the show with our friend Andrew Cabral. Over in Portugal, the country's parliament has just passed new rules for employers. They will be forced to pay penalties. This is a law now for contacting workers after hours, excluding what the law calls, quote, exceptional circumstances. I don't know what that means. These new rules are a response to the new realities working from home, and being that so many of us here in the States are still working from at least part-time, we want to know what you think. Is it time that U.S. employers follow the lead of Portugal? Or, on the other end of the spectrum, you as the employee, should there be a right to disconnect? A right to disconnect bill was filed, didn't go anywhere, in the New York City Council by a member, saying that essentially after, 5 o'clock or whatever your typical work hours were, you had a right to turn off all your devices, or at least block your employer from being in touch with you. And if you don't have either of those things, and if you're still working from home, at least part-time, if you've cooked up something on your own to maintain that ever-elusive, I think Cassie actually used the term, work-life balance, give us a buzz. 877-301-8970. If this was a civilized society, any society, this thing, wouldn't this make total sense? You essentially, you work your hours and except in exceptional circumstances, which obviously have to be defined carefully, they can't contact you, and you have a right to shut them out, right? I mean, obviously, if you're like a healthcare professional. You got to be on the clock, whatever that's called. What's it called when they're, they're on call. Yeah. Obviously, you got to do that, but that's part of your work. But short of that, it would be a huge advance to do something like that. We want to know what you think. 877-301-8970. And by the way, does anybody work at a place? Even there's no law that exists like this, we don't think, in the United States. Does your employer at least respect this kind of thing, that he or she stops texting, emailing, calling, or doesn't expect you to text, email, or call after whatever your work hours are? 877-301-8970 is our number. Now, it's hard in the news business to be doing this, but so take yourself out of it. Isn't this like total sane way to live?
It's so funny that you say that, because I was just thinking, well, of course, we're excluded from this because of our business. And then I'm thinking, how many other people are thinking, well, of course, we're excluded this because of our business. And I'm sure a lot of people...
it's not because we're elitist a-holes. It's because news happens all the time.
But then I was thinking, well, yeah. News does, but then, yeah.
If you work in an office, even you're a professional, you're a lawyer. I mean, unless your case is tomorrow...
Yeah, you're late research. I think
you're done.
And this is what I'm thinking. I think if you start to follow the thread, there are a lot of people who can argue that they need to be able to access their employees beyond hours. It's so funny because you think that we were just getting there. We were just getting there to be, as you say, a civilized society. I've always been struck by Europe and its notions of work and the extended vacation in the summertime and really adhering to a 9-to-5 schedule and having the siestas in the middle of the day and
3-hour dinners at 8 o'clock at night.
Exactly. And some countries even thinking about going to a 4-day work week, and then here we are. We finally accept working from home as a notion, but I think we're managing to wreck that too. As Andrea said, we're living at work.
That's exactly right. 877-301-8970. I know everybody knows this, but it's not changing. I mean, the reality is hybrid work. I mean, some of these companies, particularly the tech companies, are saying you can work from home forever, but a hybrid work life, not if you obviously are a grocery store worker, or you work in a hospital, or, I mean, obviously there's some professions we can't work from home, but for, 50%, 60%, some significant chunk of the workforce, part-time work from home is going to be the rule for probably forever, and I think desired by most employees who can work from home. And the question is, where do you draw the line? And Marjorie doesn't like mandates. She likes mandates a lot more the longer she and I have been together here. But our guiding principle has always been the only time you go to a mandate, it's not my guiding principle, it's hers, is when voluntarism doesn't work. When you ask people to do the right thing, and your employer, for example, and they abuse it over time, then you got to put some rules or laws in place. And I think even Marjorie would agree with that. 877-301-8970. So a right to disconnect on the part of the employee, meaning turn off devices, literally or figuratively, and a prohibition, as in Portugal, that now exists, where it is illegal, I repeat, illegal, for your boss to text you after work. Wow. Paul in Worcester, you're next on Boston Public Radio. Hey, Paul.
Hey, thanks, Jared and Jim. I'm not employed anymore, but I just figured my phone doesn't work from the time I clock out at whatever that is until the time I wake up in the morning the next day. And there's, we went from telex to fax to text to email to this and that. Now we've got this instantaneous. You have to. Anytime somebody wakes up with a notion, and they say, "I need an answer now." Mm-hmm. No, you don't. You can wait. You can, let people sleep. Let people do their thing, and they'll be better employees.
Paul, when you said your phone's shut off or whatever you said at the beginning of the call, do you mean literally you did that when you were still in the workforce, or you meant figuratively, I'm off the clock, I'm not dealing with this?
Literally, mostly after. Wow. The literal was after the first time my boss called me in the middle of the night.
Well, hey,
then
Paul.
Then I literally shut it off.
Before you go away, are you the guy that's sending us the woodworking stuff?
Yep.
Before you go, can you read the part of his email where he describes why he's sending this next batch of stuff to you, which made me laugh out loud? Or can you summarize it at least?
Paul, Jared, you open that now. Thank you.
Paul, summarize for us why you wouldn't send any package for all of us to Marjorie or me, but would send it to Jared. Quickly, if you can.
Marjorie has been accused by many people for not opening her mail ever.
Yep.
And Jim thinks that anything that he gets belongs to him.
Exactly.
So, Paul, you asked me if I would do something on your behalf. Yes, I will do that.
Paul, thanks. You're a generous guy, and thank you for your call, as always. We appreciate it. I do
So
think
great.
that whatever I open, and usually when I open, it's for me and Marjorie, but I said, hey, I got 2 of those. But that was not the intention. 877-301-8970. We're talking about something called a right to disconnect. Essentially, your workday ends when it ends, and either mechanically or by law, your employer can't be in touch with you.
Next, let's go to Kim calling from the car. Hi, Kim.
Hello, Kim.
Hi, Kim. Hi, Jim and Jared.
Hi, Kim.
Long time listener, first time caller.
Great.
My husband's mother had spent a year in and out of hospitals and nursing homes and everything, had not been in her own bed in a year. And my husband works for a small car dealership as a finance manager.
Mm-hmm.
Not a big deal, but in the last 20 minutes of his mother's life while he was bedside, he was texted and called by his boss multiple times.
Did the boss know?
Of course he knew.
No.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
That is the worst.
Because it had been weeks. It really was. And he still works there, but it's a very sore spot.
Well, I should
needless to say.
I hope so. Kim, that is a hell of a first call. Can you imagine?
No.
Can you imagine?
No.
Kim, thanks for the
It's crazy.
call. Well, that's a pretty egregious example.
That's just heartless.
877-301-8970. By the way, I'm an abuser of this, I should say. If Marjorie was here, she would have said this. Marjorie sleeps semi-normal hours. Chelsea, our former leader here, who is now running. What is her former? She's running the arts desk.
The culture desk at GBH.
Culture desk, which is wonderful for GBH, and we're so glad, even though she left us, that she's still at GBH. She was pretty bad too, by the way. She and I'd be texting at 5 o'clock in the morning. I'd be asleep by 9 o'clock at night. She'd be texting and emailing like 11 o'clock. But I think that doesn't count because we were equals, meaning I wasn't her boss, she wasn't my boss, that sort of thing. So I guess that's a little more excusable. You don't look like it is.
No,
okay.
well, I was just debating because I tend to send emails too, and then you realize, and I send them, send them, and not expecting an immediate response, but I'm just realizing in this conversation, maybe people on the other end think that they're supposed to be answering at the same time.
Marjorie says all the time, when I send her a text and she doesn't respond in a nanosecond, doesn't matter what she's doing, it's like I'm offended. It's like, how dare you? And so I am, even though I'm surely not her boss, we are totally co-equals. It imposes, even in situations where it's not an employer-employee relationship, this unpleasant obligation. Hopefully not as bad as the Kim situation with her husband, but stop it already. And if you don't stop it, we should pass laws. Greg and Hudson, welcome.
Hi, Greg.
Hi, guys. How
Hi.
are you?
Great.
I'll take a little bit of the opposite side of the coin.
Sure.
I've been working on a very flexible basis pretty much for the past 15 years. And I guess it's a trade-off. And the ability not to hop on a train and commute into the city for 2 hours or sit in traffic on the Mass Pike forever in snowstorms just to get to an office. I'm willing to take that trade-off for a few calls here and there. But I will say, I think a law is kind of an extreme, but certainly we need to put some curbs on abuse.
Well, Greg, in the abstract, your decency about this sounds fine and appropriate, but what's implicit is that by the employer is doing you a favor by letting you work at home. But I'm assuming you're I don't know, are you as productive at home as you would be if you were in the office?
Probably more so.
So why is he or she entitled to any special access to you more than he or she would if you're showing up at work?
Well, it's never been on a daily basis, guys. It's always been sort of a one-off here and there. And
you're talking about flexibility kind of thing. Well, if you don't have normal hours,
but there's flexibility on both sides.
Well,
right?
In that setting, I tend to agree. If your notion is you do your work when you do your work, as long as you get it done, that's a whole different kettle of fish. And I think your decency about it, Greg, is merited there. Thank you very much for your call. We can't do that. I mean, you got to do what you do when you do it, because that's the way this works.
Well, I think a lot of people are finding that they're shifting how they work. So maybe they work 8 to 11, and then they run and they pick up the kids from school or do this or that. So then they pick up a little bit more, do a few more hours after dinner. And so then they start emailing, and then they're kind of assuming that other people are going to start picking up a couple of hours after dinner. And this is where it becomes a very slippery slope.
Well, one of the things I've said this on the air with Marjorie is, do you work as constantly as you work when you're in the office or in the newsroom, etc. Marjorie will often disappear in between segments for the 1 minute break, or I think it's a 8 minute break at noon when the news comes. And she shows, when she comes back to the Zoom screen, she's in an apron. And so you know that during this time she's baked a cake, or she's made her prune chicken, or whatever the hell it is. It's sort of a dead giveaway.
Well, she does come back with an apron, and I've wondered what she does in that.
Well, as she says, by the way, this is not bad mouth or behind her back. She says it herself. Actually, prune chicken is fabulous. It's her one dish, and it's really high quality. Beyond that, she can't make anything. And I don't think she knows how to bake anything either. So I don't really know maybe she just likes wearing an apron when she's back. We should ask her, maybe she likes that style of dress. I don't know.
Yeah, we need to get to the bottom of
this. We
this.
do, and I think you're the man to do it, Jared.
All right, let's next go to Stefan calling from the car. Hi, Stefan.
Hey, welcome.
Hi, how are you?
Good.
So I'm looking at it from a slightly different point of view. I'm on the employer side.
Uh-huh.
And so I have a business, about 350 employees.
Wow.
And I would say about 200 of them are on the factory floor, and about 150 are in the offices. And, it's this talk, and I create a good corporate culture, and, we discuss a lot of subjects openly. And, the guys on the factory floor, they don't have that luxury. And they see it as a luxury, that work from home. They really do. They respect the guys in the office, and there's no animosity. But they understand that these guys, when they get to work from home, it's to them, it's a luxury. They get to see the kids. They get to, as you say, go to the kitchen. They can bake a cake and do what they want. They don't get to do that. They just don't. So I have to respect them from that point of view, that they don't have that luxury. So they expect us to be able to reach the guys at the house at any time, because they figure at least they've got that. And my bigger point is the corporate culture. If you create a good culture, and I don't just wear rosy glasses and believe that everything's perfect, but the people, they choose to take the call. And when we call them, sometimes late at night, I have meetings with people very late in the evenings. I get a sense that they would tell me, and I get a sense that they'd hang up. They just wouldn't pick up if they didn't want to. But I also get a stronger sense that because we create such a strong culture, which happens when we're together, in the office, in the factory, they don't mind. I mean, the guys, when I call them, they're passionate about their work. So you can't always look at it from the standpoint of the employee resents it.
But Stefan, I'm not quarreling with the culture that you say you've created there. I hope it's true. But if you were an employee who wasn't comfortable with that outreach, would you feel comfortable saying it? I probably wouldn't.
Oh, for sure.
Really?
No, yeah, absolutely.
Oh,
yeah.
okay.
And that, absolutely, it'd be no issue whatsoever. Yeah.
Well, I hope that's so. Stefan, thank you for the call. Can you imagine being responsible for 350 people? I would literally have to be hospitalized. I mean, even if I was the best, that's a lot of people. It's a lot of people. 877-301-8970. Well, that's an exception to the rule. He's an employer. He thinks he's got to. I worry about that.
But that's what the employer says.
Well, right,
I think they all want to be.
But he may be true. I mean, there are wonderful workplaces where people do feel it's collegial and do feel, if you don't have a union, and I was a former union president, it's pretty tough to speak up even to a benevolent boss. Yes, my door's always open. I'm not talking about Stefan now, but bosses say, any problem you have, my door's open. It's hard to walk through that door unless you feel you have some power, because there's such a power difference. I don't mean to get heavy about this, but you want to take one more?
Let's go to Joe, also calling from the car. Hi,
Hey, Joe.
Hello, how are you guys doing?
Excellent.
Great.
Thank you for calling.
Good. So, I heard you bring up work-life balance and being contacted outside of working hours, and I'm a musician.
Oh.
So, part of the job is, and it's funny, it's just one of the things that you kind of understand when you get when you have a career in the arts, is if your band leader calls you and you have to learn 40 or 50 songs for a wedding later on that weekend, you kind of don't really have much of a choice. You kind of just have to, dig your nose into the charts. You got to learn the songs, and you got to get it as good as you possibly can by the time of the wedding or something.
Don't you know YMCA by heart by now?
Yeah, that one and about 100 others too. But it's one of the things that you kind of have to do is, I play and I teach and everything, so I have a whole bunch of teaching positions. It's really important, as a person who's essentially self-employed, to have what I call stupid time. Yeah. This is time where I shut my phone off. I'll physically shut my phone off. I'll close my laptop. I'll say, okay, I am done for the day, and I'll go watch, I don't know, Rick and Morty or something. I'll play some video games for a little bit, in order for my brain to just rest and relax and just have nothing to do for a while. And I find I'm so much more productive the day after once I've taken that time for myself. But if I stay plugged in all the time, I just can't do it.
Totally with you. Good luck with your music, Joe. Thank you much for the call. Thank you all for your calls, actually.
And thank you for listening to another edition of Boston Public Radio. You can keep up with us 24/7 by way of our podcast. Tune in tomorrow for our Friday All-Stars, Sue O'Connell and Andy Anatko, along with Boston's most notorious all-inclusive roller skating witches.
Huh?
I know. Our crew is...
Wait a second. Bill McKibben. Is Bill McKibben on tomorrow? He is. Bill McKibben, obviously the world's probably premier environmentalist, either just back from COP26 or he may be calling us from Glasgow. So add that to your
great
list.
Great to hear from him.
Yeah.
Our crew is Zoe Matthews, Aidan Connolly, Mackenzie Farkas, and Rebecca Tauber. Our engineer is John LeClaw Parker. What's on Greater Boston?
Well, I'm off tonight. Sue O'Connell's sitting in, but I'm looking at the note I just got. How to navigate Thanksgiving, COVID anxiety, with a couple of doctors, from one from the Cambridge Health Alliance, one from an organization, the executive director of something called Vaccinate Your Family. And this one's pretty heavy. A local filmmaker from the Penobscot Nation has made a documentary called Bounty, which, yikes, details the grim history of bounties for scalping, which pretty heavy. Sue O'Connell's sitting in tonight. She'll be great, as she always is. Jared, you were great, as you always is. There's also a lot of important parts of the show today, which I rarely say, but I felt it. So hope you were here for all of it. Thank you so much. Hope you're back again tomorrow. I'm Jim Browdy.
I'm Jared Bowen.
Have a great day. We'll see you tomorrow, we hope, at 11.